Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. Today's date is December 30, 2022. It's almost the end of the year, and we're doing our COVID yearly wrap up basically. At the end of last year, 2021, we did kind of a big COVID update, and in that we said that the pandemic may just be beginning. Now, a year later, I would absolutely stand by that. We are going to finish the overview of like massive amount of articles that I've been accumulating over the last 4 or 5 months. We're going to talk about those organized into a few different sections. So in the first video, we did kind of an overview and we focused on immune dysfunction caused by COVID because COVID and HIV are the only two known viruses that attack and kill T cells. There are some other viruses that can turn immune cells like T cells cancerous, but they don't just straight out murder them. So immune dysfunction being caused by COVID infections resulting in reduced T cell counts, and then people getting hit by bacterial, viral, and fungal infections that might under normal circumstances be not a big deal. You'd be able to pass it at home, in 3 or 4 days. Now people are getting hospitalized for that, and especially children are getting hospitalized for things like RSV, which normally you would not see anywhere near this level. Also, influenza, the flu. And it's hitting people harder, so that's leading more people to say, hey, is there something going on with COVID and the immune system? So we know that some viruses, as we've covered before, can affect your immune system, like measles can wipe out your immune memory and make you have to relearn all of your immune responses. In the case of COVID, at a minimum, we're seeing diminished T cell capacity, and we reported on that, I think, like a year ago. It was quite a while ago that COVID was affecting naive T cells. This is one of the pillars of your immune system. So anyway, that was some of the stuff we were discussing in part 1 2 days ago. And then yesterday, we were talking about a number of international articles that to me seemed to add up to the theme of COVID as being underreported. Cases, deaths, hospitalizations, overall severity is being underreported. And in fact, we have some breaking news today reported by Eric Feigl-Ding from a source within the CDC that the CDC has in fact been sitting on a major outbreak. So right now, the Northeast US, I guess we can jump into some of the Biobot stuff to just get ourselves oriented. Biobot is the wastewater, and this is from today. And so you can see there, we're now in the second biggest peak of the entire pandemic, bigger than the summer's BA.5 peak, bigger than the initial peak back in spring of 2020, second only to Omicron last year around this time, which had a gigantic spike around New Year's. So this is updated yesterday from samples collected during this week. It's not complete. This isn't all of this week's samples, so that number will go up. But even with what they've put in so far, it's already the second biggest peak of the entire pandemic. And that is virus in the monitored wastewater. So if we dig into this a little bit further, this is by region. You can see that the Northeast there, the orange, is super high, and it's leading the current peak. Now, what's behind that? It's XBB.1.5. So we covered a while ago, there was an outbreak of the XBB strain in Singapore a couple months ago. And it was shown to be, the X means it's a recombinant variant. It means that it combines two different strains of the virus. Now, recombinant strains, you can do that in a lab, but you can also do it naturally. If a person gets infected with two strains at once, in the course of that infection running its course, those two strains that they're infected with can wind up swapping genetic material, basically, and that's what happened here. So, however, the XBB strain that was in Singapore is likely, and I think we'll get into some of the details, likely different than the XBB strain that is spreading in the US. And it's not just the US, it's in the UK, and I believe it went from 0% to like 4.3% in 1 week. That's incredible growth. It's in China as well. We'll get into that in a minute also. but this new XBB, I think it's 1.5 strain, has a massive growth advantage, I think even over BQ1, which is the dominant strain in the US right now and the dominant strain in the UK, by 96%. So you've got everything that BQ1 has in terms of growth, plus another 96%. So it's almost double. Not good. So the CDC has actually been sitting on that for several weeks now and not sharing that news, but that seems to be driving the New York and Connecticut sort of tri-state area outbreak over in that corner. But we'll get into more of the details. I just wanted to say that's some pretty major breaking news. We'll also look at another source. So biobot.io/data, that's what you're looking at right now. That's a great source. We're going to look at another one. There's a COVID researcher, Rajnarayan, who runs a site that tracks variants and things. We're going to look at some things from that. That's another good site to look at, and we'll get into that in just a minute. So, yeah. Anyway, we were talking about how COVID is being overall underreported, and let's get our general, there we go, tone setter. It's being underreported pretty much the world over. So as we head into 2023, not only is the pandemic not over, that's laughable, far from it, but places are opening up more and more now, including China. And we're going to read a comment from a comrade who, has been a supporter of this channel. I think that the support for China borders on delusional, and that's my opinion. We've been able to sort of message it out in a civil, comradely way, but as we'll get into in the comment when we do read it, you can't start from the position of, well, the Communist Party of China is correct. Therefore, if I don't understand what they're doing, it means I'm wrong. No, there's a possibility that what they're doing is wrong. And if it looks like from everything you can see that what they're doing is just blatantly unscientific when it comes to COVID, or even just contradictory as far as statements like, we're no longer preventing infections, we are protecting health. No, you can't protect health and allow infections at the same time. That's completely contradictory. Then you have to go with what's in front of you. That it's just too depressing to face is not really an excuse. You need to engage in, real world, open-eyed analysis here. So yeah, we got into basically it's being underreported the world over, and also some specifics about what was going on in China. In today's stream, and to wrap this up, now I will say we're wrapping it up for right now, but I still have like at least 24 tabs open. So I'm sure we're going to come back to this in a few weeks, but this is what we're wrapping it up for this particular thing. But like I said, it's been building up for a few months now, and part of the problem is news keeps breaking on COVID. No matter, how many, like I could do this every single day for 5 hours a day. As far as that's the quantity of news and studies that are coming out on COVID. None of it good. But I could do this 5 hours a day, every single day. Of course, my voice might not cooperate, as you can hear. And there would be no lack of stuff to cover. And it would all be tremendously alarming. I just can't do that, so it's been building up. Hence, we're doing it in a big lump here. But we're going to do overviews of long COVID and its effects, whether it's on kidney function or acute onset psychosis or other neurological symptoms of long COVID. Long COVID in kids, basically an entire section on kids, some sections on masking, vaccines, immune escape, myocarditis, and then possibly just some things, over-the-counter things you can do. If you do get COVID, as we've said many times, in N95 we trust, or P100, that mask is your main thing. But if you do get infected, the vaccine is plan B, and then on top of that, there are some over-the-counter things you can probably do, like some vitamin C, which is cheap and non-toxic, and we'll look at a few things related to that. So, but actually on that note of the immune system and masking, this is a great graphic. Now, this is from almost a year ago, it's from back in February, And it was as the news about the immune system and COVID was starting to spread. This is from a Twitter account at CashPrime, KASHPRIME. Your immune system is not enough. Antibody levels wane and T cells are in trouble. So your first line of defense is things like N95 masks, NPIs, ventilation, rapid tests, but these are being phased out in many places. Your second line of defense, this is if it actually breaches your body and gets inside. So that's what I said. In N95 we trust. The best thing is don't let the virus into your body using, mechanical means, masking, ventilation. Ventilation and filtration, it mechanically removes the virus from the area of your face so that it just can't get in. And then, rapid testing and people removing themselves from situations if they know that they have COVID and things like that, or at least masking with an N95 or P100. But the backup plan B, is innate immunity and antibodies. So the problem, though, is the innate immunity is disabled by the virus. So COVID is attacking your T cells. It's interfering with your ability to put out interferon to help block the virus. And Omicron has immune escape potential, which we're going to get into more of that today. There is reduced antibody efficacy or effectiveness against Omicron. It just simply, it's like you're trying to handcuff the virus with the antibodies, and it can slip out of the handcuffs. So that's kind of the ability that it is developing over time. Your third line of defense is, T cells. COVID, at that time they're saying could be damaging these. Now we know it is damaging them, and it gets worse the older you are, and it could be partly the cause of long COVID. There are probably a number of things with long COVID, persistent infection being one of them, autoimmunity developing. That's where your immune system attacks your own body instead of invading things. It thinks that your own tissue is invading foreign tissue. There is, your gut microbiome is all the different microbes that live in your mouth and on your skin, and different regions of your skin have different species of microorganisms and inside your intestines. And basically you have more non-human cells in your body than you have human cells. So that's hugely important. They make neurotransmitters like serotonin and things like that, which can cross the blood-brain barrier. So your gut microbiome is hugely important, and COVID seems to interfere with that. So COVID-induced microbiome dysfunction is part of what may be causing long COVID as well. The body is a hugely complex system with dozens and dozens, really thousands of parts, all interacting with each other in complex feedback loops. And COVID can disrupt many of them, resulting in wide-reaching symptoms, which can persist for long after the acute phase. So this leads us to kind of our three major conclusions that we would like to hammer home about the pandemic. And I'm going to actually add one. So first, there is no end in sight to the COVID-19 pandemic. This thing is not only not over, it's getting worse and is likely to keep getting worse. 2, COVID-19's effects are far worse than the average person understands. 3, the USA and most other countries, including now China, are moving in exactly the wrong direction in their response to it. And 4, we're adding today, this now includes widespread underreporting of COVID outbreaks and trends. This reduces independent researchers and advocates' ability to warn the public about current risks. And it, I say independent, but it's also state level and local public health departments. They don't get this information either because they're trusting the CDC or whatever, which is sitting on data. That's not good at all. And so if this whole thing is, it's insufficient to just rely on a strategy of calculating personal risk in relation to COVID. But if you're not even getting appropriate information, well, then that's not informed consent, because the first part, the information leading to the, informed part of the informed consent is huge amounts being withheld, or you have to go way, way out of your way to get it, like listening to a Marxist YouTube channel that has about 12,000 subscribers. So, this should be on the front page of the New York Times, etc. However, the capitalists who own this country, and including major media outlets like that, have decided it's in their interest to let this thing rip and send people to work, etc. So, okay, all of this said, let's get into a few of the current things. So, we had a question, first of all, about UV light and filtration. So, basically, the question was, if you're building a Corsi-Rosenthal box, and actually, let's put that up on the screen. I didn't think I had a visual, but we do. So this is where you tape together a number of high-quality, like, furnace filters, and then you put a box fan with a piece of cardboard with a circle cut out on top of it, and it works really, really well as a DIY air filter, much cheaper than a lot of the air filters that you can buy to put in a room. And somebody asked, can you pair this with a UV light to help kill the virus? And the answer I said is I think that's more in kind of commercial applications. If you had sort of dedicated, HVAC people, maybe you could set up a system like that with, central air or something like that. In your house in a Corsi-Rosenthal box, I don't think so was the answer. And so doing some more research on that confirmed basically my understanding. So there's kind of three major categories of UV light: UVA, UVB, and UVC. UVC is what is the most damaging, and it's also what's used for that kind of sterilization. However, it's also really dangerous. It can cause skin cancer because it's so high energy. That's how it sterilizes things, is it destroys microbes. It's so high energy. But it can do the same to your own cells and be carcinogenic and things like that. So it's dangerous to use, and it's usually just used in like hospitals and places like that where people are using it alongside good equipment. If somebody so I didn't come across anything that I thought was recommendable, but we'll keep an eye out. But I think that the UVC that you have to use with that is probably not really safe to be used indoors. And this thing, just through the sort of mechanical filtration, is probably going to do you enough good on its own. That said, the filters are going to be full of virus, so do not handle them and then be touching your face or something. You probably want to handle them with gloves, or at least really, really wash your hands with hot soapy water for at least 30 seconds after touching it at all, because it's going to be full of all kinds of stuff that it pulls out of the air, which is not so good in kind of a concentrated format. So just wanted to address that. Second point that I wanted to address is, this thing about China, and this came up after, where did I save this as? Let me just look by date. This came after just sort of mentioning China in passing in the first part of the wrap-up, not after doing the more extended thing yesterday, the extended China section. So here was the comment, and if you see this comment, like I said, this person's a comrade, don't give him a hard time, but you can see the kind of strain, and I had conversations with this person before about, revisionism from the Communist Party of China, and how starting from a position of always assuming that the CPC is correct and is not compromising or selling out or anything kind of leads you into a position of doing a lot of mental gymnastics, and you wind up kind of a human pretzel at times, and you just say, oh, well, they're basing it on something we don't know about. It's like, well, it'd have to be pretty big, and why don't we know about it then? They're strong enough to sort of control COVID, but not strong enough to get that information out. I don't really understand that. But let's read. This is sort of the devil's advocate. Not really devil's advocate. It's sincere. But the pro-China side on opening it up. So here's their comment. I think that there are some unique conditions in China and their current approach that are distinctly different from Let It Rip, which Let It Rip is what I called it. And that's basically, I think, what it looks like. If you read everything that they put out, CPC, we'll have to translate. There was a long conference, December 27, about just how this approach is not the same as the West's Let It Rip approach. And again, you can make any kind of claim that you want. In the end, does it hold up to analysis? So I just got this link out of this person like an hour or two ago, and I haven't had a chance to look at it it has to be translated first of all. So there's that. I haven't had a chance to look at it yet. I'll try to do that at some point and address it in a future stream. But anyway, you'll see that this is more of an adaptation to balance health needs without getting isolated from the international community. And my response to most of this is, but the material reality of the virus does not give you that leeway. There's only so much that you can do as far as, it's like fighting. If your house catches fire, there's a balance between how much you need to prioritize putting that fire out, and if the rest of the block is burning down, preventing your house from catching fire again, versus just going about life as usual. That's not really a balance. It's an emergency, and there's only so much you can do with that. And what they're doing, from what we have seen being reported, seems to far overstep what we know about the behavior of the virus and people's ability to contain it. All right, if you're not doing zero COVID stuff, you just can't contain it that well. That's a fact. So, yeah. And, as far as the getting isolated from the international community, that's a bit of a vague statement. They go on to qualify the risk of supply chain disruptions if things went wrong. What do you mean if things went wrong? You mean if the virus gets out of control, which it undoubtedly will, provides ample economic motivation to get this right. Couldn't you say the same thing about the West? But yet they're just letting it rip, and then they're just sort of blaming workers for being lazy. No one wants to work, etc. So what would stop them from doing that? Because it's not like this just can only go in one direction. They could just keep lying like the US does. All right? A miscalculation would be damaging to China itself and its international relations. I got news for you. I mean, there's ways around that too. There's, shifting blame and everything I just said, basically. So it's just they have to do the right thing. And basically, this point of view says the CPC is going to be doing the right thing no matter what. And that's just not a realistic view, all right? Everything that I've read from the CPC has been highly scientific, speaks directly about all the tracking and research still being done to track 130 plus subvariants, what is still needed to protect human life, and a promise to roll back approaches if things get out of control. So here's the bottom line. Things will get out of control. How long is it going to take them to roll them back? Why are they even doing this in the first place? It's entirely predictable that they will get out of control. Entirely predictable. So I don't think that that's really defensible. And you can, it's like they say there are lies, damned lies in statistics. You can use, you can hold up tracking and research and then sort of do the exact opposite while claiming that you're doing the thing that follows the research. All right, that is a thing that can be done. So I don't know exactly what was said, but I mean, the US CDC claims that they're rolling back quarantine and isolation requirements is evidence-based. It's not, but they claim that it is. So you tell me. If you study the policies still in place, they're more akin to what the U.S. tried to do in 2020, meaning that they are more strict than 90% of countries still. So part of the way that China had such success was they were really controlling their borders with respect to COVID. In fact, to the point where in 2020, people inside China didn't even need to mask necessarily because they got it under control inside the country, and then they actively, it's not just going to sprout out of the ground. They were preventing it from coming into the country, and where there was an outbreak, they did control it without letting it spread everywhere. And so people were able to kind of go about things actually as normal, unlike in the US, where if you do what the US did in 2020, everyone has to wear masks all the time because the virus is just spreading here and there. You're getting, outbreaks popping up all over the place, and you're living in a constant state of uncertainty about the COVID security in your area. All right, so that's a recipe for failure right there. China tripled its beds per capita, has extremely high vaccination rates. I mean, the same can be said of some of Europe, not so much the tripling its beds per capita, but Europe also has extremely high vaccination rates as well. and the ability to use its largely state-owned commanding heights of the economy to direct investment resources, etc., to continue the war on COVID in a new way. So here's my basic point of contention. You can't. The virus is the virus. It goes along like capitalism, very simple logic, and you just can't, invent new behavior for COVID to follow so that you can resume your own convenience. It's not possible. So what is this new way? It's what the U.S. has been doing, largely. Okay, in all the ways that matter, it's the same, as far as allowing it to spread and then thinking you can deal with that after the fact. It's going to have the same outcome. That's what I'm telling you, okay? They also have incredible masking culture, which should prove highly effective in the opening up period. Well, it should help, definitely. But with the new strains that we have now, it may not really be enough. The whole point of zero COVID was to shield China from the most pathogenic virulent strains. I don't know about this. I don't know if this is sort of, post hoc justification and rationalization now of, adding on parts of the thought process which were not actually the policy in 2020 and 2021 and earlier this year, although they have been rolling back and relaxing standards all throughout 2022. Biding time to increase medical standards and abilities. Well, time out. So, okay, you added beds to your hospital, but what happened with the virus? We have immune evasive strains of the virus now that the monoclonal antibodies don't work as well with. So you bided your time. Well, what happened? The virus evolved. So that's bullshit. Sorry, but that's a pile of horseshit. And coordinating the response with the rest of the world in order to stop the virus completely. What happened? No one outside existing socialist countries joined in. Fair, but that does not mean that relaxing the standards now is not going to be a complete disaster. All right? And that's the point. That's the only point here, is this will not work. That's the point. All right? I will gladly, learn about if this does work, which I see no way why it would work, but if it does work, I'll be happy to say, wow, they really surprised me. Here's why it worked. I'm telling you now, I would bet the farm it's not going to work, all right? If you pay attention to the 2022 battle against COVID in China, Omicron was busting through zero COVID, but China was able to handle the outbreaks in major cities while mitigating the worst consequences. Okay, so if it was even busting through zero COVID, what do you think it's going to do now? By the way, according to the official Chinese stats on what was going on this year with COVID, here are China's reported numbers. This is from Our World in Data against the United States and India. Now, India, probably this is a lack of testing that is, showing these dramatically lower numbers. The U.S., we have a lot of testing here, and so all of our cases show up. China is that little blue line at the bottom. So according to this, they've barely had any cases, including in 2020. So as far as what they were doing, it wasn't working against Omicron anyway, so why don't we just throw away zero COVID? According to their numbers, it was working. But even if it wasn't, that logic is terrible. Saying it's, doing the stricter approach isn't working, therefore let's take a less strict approach. I mean, did somebody get kicked in the head by a mule here? That's not going to help, okay? That's not going to help. Anyway, going back to the comment here, just to go all the way through this. And sorry if I'm being somewhat rude here, but, I think my rudeness versus the actual effects on people's lives in China is, that's what I'm responding to here. We have had many dead and many tens of millions crippled by COVID here in the U.S. It's going to be even worse in China. I'm not happy about that. And I'm really not happy to see this kind of total BS rationalization. All these things give me hope that the framing of total disaster coming from the U.S. is unlikely to materialize. Yeah, except they're paper thin. And it's not that it's coming from the U.S. It's coming from a place of understanding what this virus is and does, all right, called epidemiology. However, this is no doubt a horrifying and partially unknown future that could have fairly extreme consequences if they aren't able to pull it off. And that's what I'm saying. I see no reason why they would be able to pull it off. This is like total wishful thinking. It's like standing on the edge of a third-story building roof with construction paper wings and going, I believe that these wings are going to let me soar off into the sunset. However, it could have fairly extreme consequences if I'm not able to pull off this flying on construction paper wings thing. Yeah, you have no reason to believe that you can fly using construction paper wings, so don't jump. Okay? That's basically what I'm saying here. Thanks for the vid, by the way. I hope this doesn't come across the wrong way. It comes across in the same way the previous kind of delusionally pro-China stuff does come across. I would love to see China revert to its, pre-1978 push for socialism. I think that there is still potential there in China. And I do hold out some hope for that. This is not, I would say, in the more, optimism-inducing category on that front. They were setting a great example, which was a major point in the pro column for China. Rolling that back is you just can't lie to yourself. And so it comes off as that same kind of, for a while I was just sort of blocking or muting accounts on Twitter that were saying certain pro-China talking points. I just got sick of reading. I was getting into arguments with these people every single time. No doubt they're interested in communism, but it's also the cult-like mental gymnastics after a while gets really, really old. So I say this as a comrade, you've got to recover this sort of blind faith that you've put in the CPC. So anyway, that's how it comes across. Speaking honestly, that's how it comes across to me. I'm not in any way trying to minimize COVID in the slightest. Yes, but you're lending support to policy that is no doubt going to result in massive spread of COVID. So that is what this does in the end. Just trying to analyze actual Chinese conditions through an absolute shitstorm of projection and demonizing. Fair. And again, like I've said, it's very hard to get accurate information about China in the U.S. China could probably help that by putting out more stuff in English, one of the major languages in the world, to try to clarify some of that stuff. It's extraordinarily difficult to get that information here, and so even as they say, places like CGTN are losing the core of what is being said and projecting nonsense, and it is dominated by liberals. They had fucking Infracell on CGTN. They have the LaRouche people on CGTN regularly. So, yeah, CGTN, I don't take that seriously at all. And as far as reading actual stuff coming from the CPC itself, there's a lot that can get lost. Even if you use an auto-translate, Chinese to English, there's a lot that can be lost. It would be much better if it were translated by people who really get all the nuances of the language. So that I'm just saying that would really help as far as analyzing actual Chinese conditions. You really have to kind of know people in China to get any of this. And there was a commenter the other day on the other video that was sharing some of their thoughts about it. So, anyway, this isn't good news no matter how you slice it, and I do not think that there's some grand plan. Anyway, they followed up with a question, as it pertains to long COVID and the worst consequences of COVID, how do repeat infections and the Western context, don't really know what you mean, differ from China's context, which is realistically that the majority of the population has never been sick, and that Delta and the OG strain plus Omicron, the original Omicron, it's BA.1, have now been outdone by the BA variants. So, yeah, it's not going to be better for China. They are on the exact same assembly line as far as the reinfections, which is, so let's put up our reinfections thing. Here you go. The more reinfections you get, your odds of all of the complications just go up. So people in China have been protected by these policies for several years. But now that they're letting the advanced Omicron, BA2, BA4, BA5, and all the, BA5 offshoots like the BQs and the BFs, and now XBB, now that they're letting those spread to a much greater extent, whether you want to call it let it rip or not, I think is just useless semantics. It's going to amount to basically the same thing because these things spread like crazy. The R naught number, the R0, the number of individuals that an infected individual is likely to infect. We started out with about 2.5 with the original strain. We're now up to 11 to like 19. Okay? It's so much more contagious than it was. So you're talking about a population in China where their vaccinations have waned somewhat, and they don't have any of the earlier strains of, quote, natural immunity. We are not proponents of, quote, natural immunity. It comes at an enormous cost of systemic inflammation and organ damage, but it can protect you somewhat from subsequent infections. They have none of that, and they're now going to be allowing these really advanced late 2022 strains into the country. It's going to be a shit show, okay? That's what it's going to be. And the rate that it's reinfecting people, like I said, China is further back on the assembly line, but it's the same assembly line. And in fact, the assembly line is now moving faster than ever. It used to be that you couldn't get reinfected right away after a COVID infection. Now it is. So, it could be that 6 months from now, a lot of people in China will have been infected 3 or 4 times. So it's not going to be that different in the end. These policies needed to stay in place, and that's kind of the bottom line. All right, let's back to that comment. That's the wrong one. There we go. Let's see. In addition, what's the connection between long COVID and lack of intra-acute phase treatment plans? So mild, like basically asymptomatic COVID, mild COVID, moderate COVID, it's all the same risk of long COVID, basically. It varies somewhat by demographic, but it's all basically the same risk. And the one thing is if you get hospitalized, if it's bad enough for hospitalization, that dramatically increases your odds of getting long COVID. Like it puts them up to about 50, 60%. And as far as treatment plans, so these new strains are less responsive to monoclonal antibodies than ever. The Paxlovid is helpful, but I think we're going to probably see that even not being very helpful at all. It's helpful if you're over 65, maybe somewhat helpful, although not in certain outcomes like hospitalization if you're under 65. And that could be, if we get XBB spreading and then that keeps mutating, that may be completely useless sometime in 2023. We're now approaching the level of immune escape in these new variants as SARS-1. So that's where we're headed, okay? And again, could it stop? Yeah, I guess. Do we have any reason to think that these things aren't going to just keep going in that direction throughout 2023, 2024, 2025? No, we have no reason to think that. So anyway, what about underlying conditions unique to America or highly prevalent like obesity? So that is not unique to America. China's overweight and obesity numbers have been doubling, and they're now, so the U.S. is higher, and it's because of the diet and it's because of the stress and other things that can contribute to weight gain. But China is now copying those patterns. There's more Western foods over there. There's more of a high stress, low sleep culture going on because of all the capitalism that they're allowing, which is major employers in the urban areas and things like that. So the U.S. Overweight and obesity is around like 80%. In China, it's over 50% though, and climbing. So it's not that different. So as far as their underlying risk, yeah, I mean, there's a little bit less for now, but not for long, and it's not that much lower. And lack of a mask culture at all in the U.S., yeah, I mean, that's one of the bigger differences, but also, again, in China, there wasn't necessarily the need to wear a mask in a lot of the places internal in the country because it was being controlled so well. So we'll see, how the masking actually goes over at that point. The bottom line is with these strains, letting them spread is suicide. And I can't stress that enough. There's no amount of, ideological purity that is going to keep the COVID from spreading. All right. As far as striking that balance between preventing infection and, like I said, it's like striking a balance between keeping your house from burning down while the entire block is on fire and other things. There's no real balance. It's an emergency that requires almost your full attention. All right. So that said, I guess we're about ready to get into stuff. That was the preliminaries. Let us talk to the chat for a moment. We got 31 people in there, and I'm happy to see the mod because it's always a good thing to see. Thank you. Thank you, mod. All right. So where are we? Hello, I'm here to get further propagandized. Hassan is just talking about Aiden and Taint. Yeah, Andrew, what can you say? What can you say? I'm sure that's being adequately covered elsewhere. Suffice to say, we're not a pro-Andrew Tate channel in the least. In the least. Human trafficker, we'll see what comes of that. Alleged, right? I think it's alleged. He hasn't been convicted yet. We'll see. Can you be more specific on the P100 mask recommended in a previous stream? Is it the P100 FFP1 or P100 NIOSH? So FFP, I believe, is the European standard. Let me just double check that. I mean, it should be the same, basically. Yeah, FFP1 versus FFP2 versus FFP3. These are EU. Yeah, it's a European standard. So if you find, like, there's basically things equivalent to N94, N95, and the number just refers to the percentage of particles filtered. So the higher the better. N95 is very good. P100 is better. It's the gold standard for preventing respiratory infection. NIOSH is a US standard. FFP is an EU standard. They're both good, but I would go with whatever country you're in. Go with the local standard. So it's like I've said before, KN95 and N95 masks. N95 is a US standard. If you're in the US, my logic, and I believe that this is accurate, is in the US there are greater consequences for making counterfeit N95s because that NIOSH standard, it's the local jurisdiction. We have seen many reports that the KN95s, which is a Chinese standard, it's not that they're, it still filters 95% of the particles. That's not the issue. It's that selling them in the U.S., there are fewer consequences because it's not a U.S. home jurisdiction standard. So if you sell like a fake KN95, there have been reports that up to 60% of the KN95s being sold in the U.S. are counterfeit. I can't substantiate that, although I've seen that claim repeatedly. So I would go with just the N95s because that's the homegrown standard, and it's probably more likely to be followed and less likely to be counterfeit. So I would say the same with the P100. Go with the, if you're in the EU, get an FFP1 P100, and then get a NIOSH if you're in the U.S. So there you go. China relaxed their COVID rules, and now they're getting hammered with COVID. Yes, they are. And we talked yesterday about BF7, which is a BA5 strain spreading there. And these things spread like crazy once you let them go. They also have an XBB, and we're about to cover that next. Yeah, they were having protests. They're led by the petty bourgeoisie. And actually, you know what? Let me go in, see if I can read that comment. This is a commenter from China. You know what? I should have a screenshot. I should be able to put this up. Let me see if I have it. There was another commenter talking about. Do I have it? Yeah, I don't see it. I don't know what I saved it as. You know what? I'm not going to be able to do it. But just go into the recent streams. Aaron Huang was giving some information from inside China that I thought was interesting. Basically, just about how the liberal factions within China are leading, all of this COVID rebellion stuff. The worst part is that they haven't gotten access to the Pfizer intellectual property. Yeah, that's one thing the U.S. absolutely needs to do is release the intellectual property on the vaccine. They won't do that. My manager got COVID and infected 2 other employees. Your manager's a fucking asshole. COVID is now officially the most contagious virus of the modern era, right? I believe so, because measles, its number is 12, and, COVID has a range below that, the current strains, but it also goes much higher than that. So, yeah, I believe so. Yeah, endemic is used when a disease has a predictable case level and is localized. We are in an endless pandemic. Yes, that's fine, and thank you for correcting yourself. You were misinformed on COVID being endemic. So we covered this in a previous stream. There are basically 3 major categories: endemic, epidemic, and pandemic. Endemic is confined to a local area, and it's sort of native to that area. You have a pathogen that is native and predictably found in that area, and its spread is not uncontrolled. It's at a predictable level. It's neither rising nor falling, and it's just sort of a part of that ecosystem. An epidemic is fairly uncontrolled spread in a larger geographical region, and it can be things not just pathogens, but anything that generates unhealthy outcomes. So like smoking, if there's a rise in the incidence of smoking, new people taking up smoking, that would be considered an epidemic. Obesity can be considered an epidemic because it's associated with worse health outcomes, things like that. A pandemic is not limited to any geographical region. That would count for COVID. And it's spreading uncontrollably. That would also count for COVID. It's mutating to the point where there's a new dominant strain every 2 or 3 months. And so, yeah, I would definitely say pandemic. So all the people, including people like Anthony Fauci, were out of the pandemic phase. It's complete bullshit. So anyway, make a Corsi Rosenthal helmet. I would love to see that. That'd be funny. Although you'd have to cut eye holes in it. Or I guess you could just mount a camera on the front. Of course, we're joking. This would be hilarious to see, though. You could just mount a camera on the front and like an iPad on the inside, and then get all of your air filtered through there. At that point, you'd probably just want to go get like a biohazard suit. But more evidence that China is a social democracy. The bourgeoisie in China and even the petty bourgeoisie have won. And again, I think that that's probably the more reasonable interpretation here, rather than there's some grand plan to like let COVID spread as part of building socialism. I would love it if that were true. There's nothing really logical about taking that viewpoint, though. Anecdotal, but COVID is popping off all around me in the USA, but lots of people are refusing to test and seek treatment, even rest. Yeah, that's why we look at wastewater, because the tests are just not being counted anymore. Very few people are getting PCR tests, which actually do get logged with the official government numbers. The rapid tests, they get tested at home and thrown in the garbage, and that's the end of that. So yeah, COVID and sewage is continuing to increase everywhere. And partner and I are COVID positive. Partner's family is showing symptoms and refusing to cancel holiday plans. Dumbass boomers. Unfortunately, it's not just the boomers. They've been, as with many things, raised in a culture of extreme individuality and me-firstism. The me generation was the nickname for the boomers. But it's now kind of everybody. It's just being promoted throughout society. But yeah, they can be massively stubborn. Massively stubborn and selfish. So my sympathy, solidarity to you. Trying to get antivirals, but they're low in stock apparently. But my symptoms are pretty minor. We're going to cover some things you can maybe do at the end of the stream, which are cheap and non-toxic. I don't think they're going to hurt you. Things like melatonin, vitamin C, vitamin D, zinc, stuff like that. So yeah, we'll talk about that more at the end. Just start the timer and see how long it takes for someone to call you Biswo. You know, I'm just more interested in the reality at this point. I don't really care about the propaganda. Zero COVID is the only sensible policy, you're right. Yeah, it's a Chinese word that white Western Marxists have adopted to insult anyone who doesn't abide by the CPC's line. Yeah. Also important is that the translators understand Marxism, not just Chinese and English, otherwise the translations are really bad. Good point, so that the particularly Marxist terms are brought across and then can be evaluated by non-Chinese speaking Marxists. Good point. Communists must always be willing and able to critique it as part of the dialectical process and how we can address problems in our movement. Could not agree more. I was starting to view Dungism in at least a positive light. This would be support for the post-1978 capitalist reforms brought about under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping. Even if I didn't support it until they did this COVID heel turn. I mean, yeah, you could at least say, well, they're allowing massive amounts of capitalism, which continues to grow and grow. For example, just put on the screen here, so people know some idea what we're talking about. The public sector, private sector. So you can see urban employment, 1995 versus 2018. Exports, again, this is 1995 versus 2018. Private sector contribution and how it has grown in that time, it's pretty significant. And, you know, at some point, if you don't rein it in, which again, the idea here is they're doing it to sort of stay competitive and build up their technology, I can appreciate to a certain extent that reasoning, because I think they are doing some of that. But the question is, can you actually do this in a way where it doesn't just overtake your country? I think we're now seeing that with COVID as well. Oh, we're just going to allow a little COVID. Yet COVID doesn't work that way. You can't just allow a little COVID. It doesn't obey your commands like that. And you know, they say that the capitalists can obey the control of the CPC. You know, and it's just sort of like, this is definitely a different approach than any other socialism has taken before. It's a huge gambit at best, and many people have said that it's not working out. According to that, all they're really doing is privatizing stuff and building capitalism, not contributing to some long-term socialism, but actually moving away from that. But again, you kind of got a similar situation metaphorically here with the COVID itself at this point. You just can't really reason with it, even less so than capitalists. So R11 to 19, that's the most infectious anything has ever been. Measles is R12, and that was the most infectious previously, yeah. Yeah, so you could at least say China was doing something different with zero COVID up till now, and you can't even say that anymore. Also, you can be asymptomatic and have COVID. That has been almost completely forgotten in the media, yes. I saw a vendor online that was selling bootleg KN95s. Yeah, apparently it's a big problem. I haven't been able to dig into the research there. For me, the KN95s don't really form a good seal on my face, so I've always preferred N95s, and I also got a P100 recently, so that works well for me, and I've never really had an interest in the KN95s, but a lot of people use them, so. COVID is currently BSL 3, so biosafety level 3. Do you think it can become BSL 4 when the virus gets worse over time? So let's take a look at something. My understanding is Japan just downgraded it. And trying to find a thing here. I mean, to answer your question, if the virus changes over time, then its behavior and characteristics and pathogenicity change, then you would have to change the way that it is viewed. However, you see some things, I'm pretty sure. So what's on biosafety level 4? List of biosafety level 4 organisms. I don't know off the top of my head. Human threats. Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever, Ebola virus, Marburg virus, monkeypox, a bunch of other stuff, flavivirus, human or animal threats, Rift Valley fever. It's a pretty short list. If COVID's behavior evolves to be much worse, then it's possible, sure. I mean, it's already far more contagious. It spreads much more easily. And a lot of, as we were saying before, the apparent mildness, quote unquote, of Omicron is due to the fact that people have been infected so many times. If you take that away, which, for example, China doesn't have that, it's not going to look very mild at all. So, yeah, and Omicron is also not milder than the original strain. It was like 10% milder than Delta or something like that, but Delta was much more severe than the original strain. I had someone come into work with COVID and did not tell anyone and came without a mask too. Got most of the people in the workplace sick. This is getting crazy because of acting like this is over and COVID was only in 2020. My sympathies again, that is hugely frustrating. And we need to shut this down. I don't know what else to say. Speaking of people acting like nothing's going on, I had to go to the grocery store today and I saw maybe 7 people besides myself wearing masks. Shit's ridiculous. It is ridiculous. Zero COVID is the only policy. It's just a question of when its implementation is forced and unfortunately will be far later than much more mass disability and death. So let's get into some of the lead stories before we start any of our main sections today. We have so much to do. I don't even know how long we're going to be going for today. I'm not even going to hazard a guess because I just really want to get this done. So let me go back to, there we go. Got something to just kick things off here. This is from a former head of the CDC under Obama. This is published in The Atlantic. 3 solutions for public health and 1 dangerous idea. So talking about the CDC, the agency I used to lead is beset by slowness, impracticality, and lack of strategic thinking. But its mission is too essential to abandon, by Tom Frieden. So the agency's all fucked up, but you can't just get rid of it, in other words. With more than 1 million Americans dead from COVID-19, monkeypox in all 50 states, and polio likely to have been spreading for months unrecognized, that was in New York, one of the few uncontroversial observations about public health in the United States is that it is ailing. But accurate diagnoses of the problems with public health are essential, and some suggestions for reform have potentially deadly consequences. Getting the diagnosis right and doing so quickly is the first step toward restoring trust and saving lives. Now, time out here for some quick perspective. We are in a phase of capitalism in the U.S. and in most other advanced capitalist countries called neoliberalism. So in the development of capitalism, we've basically had 3 major phases. So you had the initial ascendant phase, free market, basically unregulated classical liberalism, early phase capitalism. This kind of culminated in the Gilded Age, robber baron period in the late 19th century. And in the early 20th century, you had massive pushback in the form of socialist and progressive reform and revolutionary movements, labor movements, groups like the IWW in the United States, Marxist groups, socialist and communist parties. And then we got, some countries had full-on revolutions, such as Russia. Others had social democratic compromises where, unlike in revolution, the capitalists weren't deposed and, a workers' government wasn't set up in their place. But the capitalists stayed in power But they did grant concessions and, made a social safety net and gave more workers' rights enshrined in law. Not to say that things were perfect, and there were still massive discrepancies across ethnic and racial lines, etc. But it was a framework of concessions and some redistribution and regulation and things like that. But the capitalists stayed in power. It was still capitalism. So you get this kind of golden age of social democracy in the mid 20th century. And then by the 70s, the capitalist class has decided, hey, let's make a push to just chuck this whole thing and roll it back. We're going to go back to classical liberalism, just free market, laissez-faire, unregulated capitalism, and we're going to chuck this entire social democratic framework and just go at it hardcore again. Now, there are some underlying reasons for this, like people have argued that it's due to capitalism's falling rate of profit, and they just had to dig in harder to get more profits, and we see more of the financialization of the economy in this period. But the bottom line, and this basically goes in time with the rise of like libertarianism throughout the 70s, by the late 70s, and especially in the Ronald Reagan era, you get the neoliberal push, the neoliberal consensus in the ruling class, that basically they were going to deregulate private business, privatize everything that they could, and then defund and whittle away at whatever public stuff they couldn't completely privatize. So deregulate, privatize, and defund. That's been kind of the mantra of this neoliberal era, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s. I would say in the 2000s this ramped up substantially with Bush and Cheney's war on terror as an international meta framework for invading multiple countries and creating a much more intensive domestic police state. Then you have the 2008 crash, in the wake of which we get, austerity becomes a household word, the slashing of social safety nets in all of the formerly social democratic countries, major rollbacks to now we're, just riding on rails, basically. There's no air left in the tires at this point as far as the previous social democratic era. So we're deep into neoliberalism now, like 4 decades deep into it. And, public health has suffered as a result of this, for example. So there's this question of the ruling class wants to just keep cutting everything to the bone. And people, of course, are starting to really push back on this and start talking about socialism and what can we do instead of this rapidly encroaching fascist nightmare that is showing its head more and more fully with every passing year. Well, trying to revive public health in the midst of neoliberal austerity is like impossible. So this guy was under Obama. I mean, you need revolutionary changes at this point. He's not going to be advocating for that, but that's the overall context in which we should read this article structurally. So the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or the Centers for Disease as we call them, the agency that I led during the Obama administration, has just released commitments to improve its ability to protect health and save lives. The CDC's push for faster responses, clearer, simpler, and more consistent communication and public guidance, better and more timely data, and a culture focused less on publishing academic papers than on nimble action is a step in the right direction. These greatly needed and long overdue improvements acknowledge many of the agency's problems. But again, hate to be a nitpicker here, but they can release all the commitments they want. Look at how they're handling at the same time COVID. They're continuing to just gaslight everyone about it and roll back the recommendations. So they're doing the exact opposite of what would be effective. But even if the CDC's proposed reforms succeed, much of what's broken is outside of the agency's control. The United States suffers from chronic underfunding of local, city, and state public health departments, a healthcare system that is not structured to provide consistent care to patients, lack of standardization across states for collecting and reporting anonymized data for disease detection and response, and a broad increase in political polarization that shrinks the space for nonpartisan action and organizations. This whole partisan thing, the Democrats are fully on board with the neoliberal consensus, so you can kind of forget about that. White House actions under both, so he kind of contradicts himself here, Actions under both Republican and Democratic administrations have undermined the CDC's credibility, its freedom to speak directly to the media and public, and the public's perception of its scientific independence. Yeah, so this isn't really so much about nonpartisan action. There's a bipartisan neoliberal consensus. To highlight these extrinsic factors is not to excuse the CDC's failures during the COVID response, but to frame realistic expectations for what reform can accomplish. As the prescriptions of CDC Director Rochelle Walensky acknowledge, the agency has failed, among other things, to communicate clearly, promptly, and effectively about emerging health threats, have timely and accurate data, provide practical, implementable guidance, and adequately explain the rationale for its recommendations. And as we've said before in covering that, Walensky can do all the mea culpa she wants. They still haven't changed course. You know, your apology doesn't mean that much when you're still doing the same thing. It's like standing there with like a machine gun mowing people down, being like, I'm so sorry. I have failed you. I shouldn't be shooting you. Yeah, well, you could start by not doing that, but they're still putting out this horrible COVID advice, and let alone mandates. One unequivocal failure was the CDC's initial laboratory test for COVID, which contributed to the explosive spread of a disease in the early months of 2020. Although the CDC has now published a scientific article with a clear explanation of the laboratory test error that proposes fixes to prevent a similar problem in the future, it has not spoken to the public about the incident or about specific errors in guidance, communication, and timeliness. Again, I would add, including ongoing ones. Doing so will help to rebuild public trust and support. Good luck at this point. Good luck at this point. It is so damaged. 3 fundamental intrinsic problems the CDC must address are slowness, impracticality, and lack of strategic thinking. Also, just, you're not even remotely on target. So, I mean, that's whatever. Walensky's reforms hint at these, but not at the etiology of these weaknesses. The root cause of the first 2 problems is that too few of the thousands of dedicated expert staff have substantial experience implementing public health programs in the field. So, in other words, they know the research, but not the implementation. And the lack of strategic thinking is nearly inevitable in an agency that Congress has divided into more than 150 different budget lines. 3 essential reforms can make the CDC much more effective at detecting and stopping health threats. First, Congress must provide the CDC with sufficient, stable, and efficient funding, including flexible emergency contracting authority. Adjusted for inflation, the CDC's budget is 25% lower than it was in 2004. We spend at least 300 times more on our military defense. And again, the U.S.'s military defense is not mostly defense, it's mostly offense. They need to, any country that doesn't play ball with the U.S.'s rapidly expanding capitalism, aka imperialism, will get militarily handled by the U.S., and that's what the overwhelming majority of the U.S. military budget goes into. Agencies such as the National Institutes of Health and the Department of Defense receive predictable annual funding increases that outpace inflation. Why should the CDC, tasked with the health defense of the nation, be different? The CDC, unlike FEMA, lacks sufficient authority to work quickly in an emergency. But again, they're not even using the power they do have currently. So, I mean, I want to agree in principle, but the reality says that this is not really the problem. The CDC, unlike FEMA, lacks sufficient authority to work quickly in an emergency, and it faces a tangled mess of budget lines that constrain the agency from reallocating resources when it needs to mount a swift response. So, time out again. If you will recall, the mask mandates, the dismantling of which in May 2021 crippled the U.S.'s pandemic response and paved the way for massive spread of first Delta and then Omicron. Those were local, state, and city mandates. So those were coming from the state governments, not the CDC. It was the CDC's recommendation, but it was the states. And they were all taken down simultaneously, and in Europe, which is obviously outside the CDC's jurisdiction. This is clearly bigger than just the CDC and its funding and this and that. This is a consensus by the global capitalist class. All right? So just remember that. It was your state and maybe city public health departments that undid those mask mandates. The CDC may have recommended it, but they're the ones that did it. So this isn't just the CDC and Congress. Okay. As New York City Health Commissioner, I had access to $20 million to $40 million a year in flexible funding, compared with amounts ranging from $0 to $3 million a year as CDC Director. As Director, I made more than 250 trips to Washington, D.C. to try to increase the CDC's budget and build strong and deep bipartisan support. Congress must provide the CDC with sustained funding, potentially by advancing a new budget mechanism to ensure that resource requirements can be met regardless of budget caps. The CDC's proposed reforms include administrative improvements, which, while not the stuff of headlines, are vitally important. These include authorities that Congress can grant to increase the flexibility of hiring, improve policies for hazard and overtime pay, and enable quick procurement and contracting in an emergency. Giving the CDC authority to collect standardized, anonymous health data is also crucially important. Okay, yes, however, again, let's step back and look a bit more structurally. We covered last January. Go to S4A, the YouTube channel, and search on Zients, Z-I-E-N-T-S. This was Biden's first COVID czar, and that oversaw some of the worst stuff. He was someone with no experience in public health or medicine or biology or anything. You know what his expertise was? He was from Bain Capital, Mitt Romney's place. And so he had experience as a vulture capitalist. You know, like basically, like stripping companies down to their component parts and like selling them as such. That was his expertise. And this was the person basically running, he was the COVID czar. So when you have that in the White House, what goes on at the CDC, I mean, yeah, you could say it's a check on it, but there's close ties. Again, it's part of the capitalist class consensus here, based on overall trends within capitalism. Second, the CDC must exponentially increase collaboration with state, city, and local health departments. Well, to the extent that, the mask mandates came down, they all came down the same week. So that seemed pretty coordinated to me. It was just bad advice. So, yeah. Although the CDC currently embeds more than 600 staff members in health departments around the country, including epidemic intelligence service officers, public health associates, and specialists in immunization, tuberculosis, and sexually transmitted infections, we need 5 to 10 times that many. Staff need at least 2 to 5 years in the field to gain hands-on experience before rotating to CDC headquarters to infuse the organization with a renewed focus on rapid, practical action, when the capitalists who own this country see fit and allow it. Because isn't that the real problem? I mean, yes, these are problems, what he's describing. But why are they happening? And even if you had something different, who would still be whispering in the president's ear, change it, put the Bain Capital guy at the head of this. You would think none of that was happening here. You would think this is purely just a problem of rearranging the bureaucracy. It is not. It's a problem of capitalism. For this to occur, Congress will need to provide more resources and mechanisms to enable a locally embedded workforce, just as we would never subject ourselves to surgery by a doctor who had only textbook familiarity with a complex operation. We shouldn't accept a CDC workforce that lacks frontline experience implementing public health programs in the field. The crucial need to align the CDC with state and local public health agencies has not received nearly the amount of attention it deserves. Public health works when it's community-focused, locally led, and connected to trusted systems of healthcare. Okay, that's true, and you need the federal support to back up those local and state actions. But again, what has been the federal position? You've got Walensky running cover for rolling back everything. It's like when they did the Puppies and Rainbows map, when they changed the community transmission map to the community risk levels map, where everything looks green all the time, even when it really should be running in the red. So that was something the CDC did, and that wasn't a result of any of this, not enough people embedded. It was a result of what do the people who own this country want? They want people to go back to fucking work. Third, and most important, the CDC needs to regain its voice and rebuild trust with the American people. It sounds wonderful, but these are empty words. The White House and the Department of Health and Human Services must give the CDC and its subject matter experts the independence and freedom that they had during the agency's first 70 years to speak with the media at length, sharing the deep knowledge of CDC scientists and the reasoning, dilemmas, and potential shortcomings behind their recommendations and guidance. So you could say that this is part of fascisation, the implementing of fascism as capitalism gets into deeper and deeper crisis and needs to restrict any real freedom of communication, freedom of science, etc. So you can't just make these recommendations, which are coming out of a need to turn the U.S. more overtly fascist in the way that the government operates. You're not just going to merely, Democratic Party reform your way out of that. First of all, the Democratic Party isn't really interested in making these reforms. And second of all, it's coming from a much bigger need of the overall system for that science and that speech not to be shared freely. The CDC literally wrote the book on communication in a health emergency, yet it has not consistently followed, or perhaps not been allowed to follow, its own advice. So, okay, now we're getting a little closer. Not been allowed to follow its own advice. And why is that? Well, who's that coming from? Let's get into that more. This would be a better article. Tell people what you know, how you know it, what you don't know, and what you're going to do to try to learn more. Be first, be right, be credible, be empathetic. So empathy is a nice word to use. We're talking about a system, though. Empathy is understanding other people's feelings. Sympathy is when you actually feel other people's feelings. Empathy is when you understand people's feelings and are able to communicate them back to that person to demonstrate that understanding. We are in a system, though, where the people who own and rule this country have diametrically opposed interests to the overwhelming majority of the population of this country. What's good for the 1% is bad for the 99%, and vice versa, because they exploit our labor to build their wealth. And, so how far does that empathy actually run in the system? We need a new system that is not based on capitalism. And give people practical things to do to protect themselves, their families, and their communities. Walensky is right to champion the CDC's unparalleled scientific expertise. I miss being able, as CDC director, to speak with some of the world's top experts about pretty much any emerging or re-emerging health problem. Because during your time, there weren't these problems that were threatening the existence of capitalism. Okay, that's the difference. Is practical things that people can do to protect themselves, their families, and their communities, at this point is coming up against and threatening to intrude into capitalism's functioning. And capitalism comes first. That's the priority. It's the quarterly profits. Those are going to come first. Okay, so that's why this is happening now. Every person in the U.S. should have this privilege through improved communication by the CDC. Rebuilding trust will require hearing from people at its headquarters in Atlanta who have worked on outbreaks for decades, not from White House or Health and Human Services appointees. The challenges to our public health system are not new, and addressing them will not be easy. As CDC director, I scraped together funds to create the Public Health Associate Program, which has put more than 1,000 people into state and local health departments. The program was a good first step, but it needed to be much larger. I realized the labs were struggling and put laboratory safety and science under an office that would report directly to me, a move that was later reversed. And I tried to fix some of the agency's budgetary problems by consolidating budget lines to provide greater flexibility in spending, learning the hard way that consolidating lines could backfire and set the stage for cuts. In short, I saw many of the agency's problems and did my best to fix them, but although I made some progress, it wasn't nearly enough. Those experiences now inform my suggestions. One particularly dangerous prescription for reform, the public health equivalent of a quack cure, advocates a return to the agency's founding mission, code for eliminating programs that reduce the burden of the country's leading causes of death. So, agreed. This is usually, when you get people who call themselves constitutionalists, this is usually like, we need to go back to the U.S. government we had in 1776, when it was still an agrarian society, the technology was on a completely different planet, etc. That's usually what that means. Like, go back to its founding purpose, is like, cut it back to 1776 levels, or 1800s levels, something like that. The CDC's core mission is to save lives and protect people from health threats. If we swallow this miracle cure of limiting the CDC's reach to only infectious disease, an idea favored by the tobacco, alcohol, and junk food industries, more Americans will die. Public health monitoring and action, led by the CDC, have driven much of our progress in reducing deaths from heart disease, stroke, and cancer. A review of the CDC's first 50 years identified important progress in the areas of motor vehicle crash fatalities, workplace injury and exposures, food safety, maternal and child health, access to safe family planning, dental caries, that's cavities, and tobacco use. So as you can see, public health encompasses a wide variety of areas. Any one of these programs may be relevant to an emergency response. In the 2016 response to the Zika outbreak, which I oversaw, experts from the birth defects, reproductive health, mosquito control, mosquito-borne, laboratory testing, and health communications staff, among others, all worked together intensively and successfully to safely stop the spread of the disease and protect infants from birth defects. COVID-19 has again demonstrated that infectious diseases hit people with underlying illness hardest, which is most people, honestly. Removing these programs would reverse decades of progress, further diminish the U.S.'s already lagging health status relative to our global peers, and force the CDC to confront health threats with the equivalent of one arm tied behind its back. And so again, this is correct, everything that he just said, within the framework of public health. But again, where is this push coming from? Yes, particular industries like tobacco, alcohol, junk food, they directly lose out on that. When people know to avoid those products, they can't sell as many of those products. But overall, where is this push coming from? And that is just a capitalism level problem. While traveling in Europe, Asia, and Africa recently, I heard from health and public health leaders that the CDC's loss of trust and respect is not just dangerous for the United States. It is, as one public health leader in Africa told me, a catastrophe for global public health. The CDC has been the flagship of public health for 3 generations, I guess, and the world is counting on the U.S. to restore the institution. And the most important, I don't know, important, yes, definitely. Fixing the agency requires accurate diagnosis, appropriate prescriptions for change, and persistence in seeing needed changes through to actual implementation. And there he ducks out. Again, we don't really get at most of the structural problems behind this and frames it. I mean, he says it's both Democrats and Republicans, but it's pretty vague as far as like where exactly is this coming from. All right, that's where we step in, of course. Now, let's look at some breaking news involving the CDC. This is from Eric Feigl-Ding. Next big one. CDC has royally screwed up. Unreleased data show XBB.1.5, a super variant, surged to 40% of the U.S.'s overall COVID load. CDC has unreported for weeks. They have not been reporting this for weeks. And it is now causing hospitalization surges in New York and New England. XBB.1.5, a new recombinant strain, is both more immune evasive and better at infecting people than BQ, which is the BQ1, BQ11, that's dominant in the US otherwise, and in the UK, or is close to dominant in the US anyway. Multiple models show that XBB.1.5 is worse in transmission R values, what we were talking about before, and infection rate than previous variants, faster by leaps and bounds. J.P. Weiland did some of the earliest models on XBB.1.5, watching data in New York. It has only grown worse nationwide. So you can see there the curve. So BQ1, as it was heading up to a certain point in its peak, it took 26 days. XBB.1.5 from 0 to the same point took only 17 days. That's a dramatic reduction. All right. And then as far as the other ones, weekly weekly case increases of total cases, XBB.1.5 right at the top there. And that's a chart of days since 1% of cases, or since it became 1% of the cases. So this is a wildfire strain. In fact, when J.P. Weiland first modeled XBB.1.5 before Christmas, the data shows that XBB.1.5 was 108% faster than the previously king BQ1 variant. But with more data, XBB.1.5 has further accelerated to now being 120% faster. So this thing is blowing away the previously dominant strain again. And they keep outcompeting themselves, and there just continually are new variants emerging. So regarding the data, and that's the CDC's nowcast chart, they were sitting on this. Notice that XBB.1.5 was not reported last week or any prior week. However, my source within the CDC Information Network let me know that the CDC somehow has not been reporting that XBB.1.5 was over 1% for several weeks. The CDC did not break this out on the chart so you could see it by itself as it promised. CDC's thing is that once a variant reaches 1% prevalence, that they give it its own color. They break it out so that you can follow it individually. Well, they didn't do that. And does this have anything to do with business as usual going up into Christmas? My guess is yeah. This exact incompetence, if it's incompetence, I don't think it is, at the CDC and not breaking out a new variant happened 2 months ago too. We reported on that at the time. When I first warned about it, when the CDC didn't break out new variants over 1%. But this is now worse. XBB.1.5 is going from unreported to 40% overnight on the CDC website, maybe soon. So you can see the chart there. This is escape from immunity is the y-axis going up. And then it is, I can't even read the bottom there. But I think we're going to get into that. Here, let me just look that up real quick. So I have to go into a separate thing to see it. Come on now. Sorry, sometimes my own charts in the monitor here are just not big enough for me to read. Okay, so average ACE2 binding. So in other words, how infectious it is, basically, because the ACE2 receptor is where the spike protein gets into most of your cells, not in your T cells, as we covered 2 days ago, but most of your cells. That's how it infects your brain, your lungs, your heart, your liver, your kidneys, your gut, and so on, male reproductive organs, etc. Anywhere that has a lot of ACE2 receptors. ACE2 is a hormone used in systems in your body normally, and that's COVID hijacks it to get in. So the blue circled is XBB. Look at how high up it is on the escape from immunity. It's at the top. So anyway. Let's go on to the next slide there. And indeed, my scoop on the CDC's unpublished data and disastrous reporting delay was indeed confirmed 2 months ago. I was told by sources that CDC's leadership was upset at me for posting leaked data. They promised to do better. Now, epic fail again. I previously warned about XBB from Singapore, but people need to realize XBB.1.5 is likely an American-originated recombinant variant that is 96% faster, meaning worse, than old XBB that hit Singapore. The XBB.1.5 popped up in the New York area in October and has been causing trouble since. There's a retweet of JP Weiland. Seen a few articles now talking about XBB from Singapore or from Asia spreading in the Northeast, but no. XBB.1.5 is spreading in the Northeast, evolved from the Singapore's XBB. American XBB.1.5 has a huge transmission advantage over XBB. New York has been suffering the largest COVID-19 hospitalization in almost a year, and it's not coming down quickly like in recent waves of Omicron. That's because XBB.1.5 is not your typical Omicron. It's a special recombination mixture variant that is further mutated. So we'll see this when we look at the variants more closely, but basically Omicron was like a quantum leap over previous strains. It was the most mutated strain by far. It made a big jump. By comparison, the original strain in alpha, delta, gamma, beta, they were all more closely related. Omicron was like a big jump away from them. It was related. It was a mutation of them, but it was a big jump away. It was, the Omicron family is more sort of similar to itself than it is to the earlier strains. Now, XBB is like another big jump, and it's not going to be behaving the same way as Omicron. Wastewater SARS coronavirus 2 concentrations are now the second highest of any wave. So some wastewater data from Biobot right there. The highest since the initial Omicron wave, especially in the Northeast US. And it's still climbing. Again, the poop data doesn't lie. It's got to be a more dignified way of saying that, but there you go. So let's validate this XBB.1.5 driving hospitalizations surge hypothesis. Where else is XBB.1.5 now dominant? Well, it's dominant in Connecticut. And is hospitalization surging in Connecticut recently? Yes. Need more proof? Validate this XBB.1.5 driving hospitalization surge hypothesis. Where else is XBB.1.5 now dominant in New England, Massachusetts? And is hospitalization surging in Mass recently too? Yes, just like New York and Connecticut. 3 separate states, all XBB.1.5 dominant. He later apologizes these charts are actually mixed up. He put, I think, one of the New Jersey charts or something, but it's actually the same thing anyway. So we know that XBB.1.5 is one of the most immune-evasive variants known to date. It's on par with our ability to neutralize distant cousin SARS-1 from decades ago, which, by the way, had a much higher mortality rate, like 10 to 15%. That means it's bad. But evading neutralization isn't everything. It's also about success in infection and binding cells, which seems to be lower. And that's what we saw on that earlier chart. It's much more immune evasive, but it had lower ACE2 receptors. So there's something, or ACE2 receptor binding. Thus, if we look at the ability of XBB.1.5 in binding to the ACE2 cell receptor, XBB is much better in binding affinity to ACE2 than, oh boy. Oh, so that old chart we were looking at, that was the original XBB. That's why it looked familiar. So correcting that, XBB.1.5 is much better in binding affinity to ACE2. That's bad. It means it can infect you more easily than both old XBB and better than BQ.1.1. Note, BA.2.75, while it had good ACE2 binding, isn't that evasive, although it was pretty evasive. XBB.1.5 is hence worse on both fronts, immune evasion and capability of binding to your cells and infecting them, making more copies of itself and killing the cell. Let me translate the above for folks. XBB.1.5 is 1. One of the most immunity-evasive variants to date. 2. One of the best variants for entry and invading human cells. 3. Appears to spread much faster than old XBB or BQ. So that's old XBB, not old BQ. BQ is current. And 4, it causes hospitalizations wherever it's dominant. So you can see here, this is the BA2 lineage, and that created BJ1, BA2.75, BA4, BA5. Now the XBB is coming out of the lineage of 2.75, and it's got all these mutations, and it's kind of sort of branching off on its own. Many people are asking if the older Wuhan 1.0 or the bivalent Omicron vaccines will still work. I say that the bivalent BA5 used in the US and the bivalent BA1 used in the UK likely has some efficacy, but it's unclear how much, because XBB.1.5 is a special recombination of BA2 strains, so we don't know. So he's going to pause, and he's saying hopefully the CDC will get their act together. As a little plug for his site. The thread continues, and he notes the typo above. He said here are the correct surge charts for XBB.1.5 in Massachusetts and New Jersey, so that's corrected there. The thing with the circles on the left, we're going to get into that more in detail. That is a chart that shows the share, market share, if you will, of the different strains in different regions. But like I said, more detail coming in a minute. Where else is XBB being found in the U.S.? Well, it's being found in all of the states bordering New York and in New England, but it's also beginning to be seen in the South and in California, which does a lot of sequencing. So Rajlab N has the best US variant dashboard, better than the CDC's. So you can see there in that chart, and let me just get a bigger copy because my monitor is a little bit small there. And we'll read out what's going on in that left side of the chart. So overwhelmingly, New York is leading, has the biggest count of the XBB 1.5. Following it are New Jersey and Connecticut at about a quarter of the rate, and they're about tied with each other. Followed by California, then Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Texas, Rhode Island, Maryland, Virginia, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Florida, and then lower on from there. So you can see the really big circle on the right is New York with 199, and then Connecticut, New Jersey in the 40s, California 23. So it is spreading. And there's XBB1 in New York, New Jersey, California, Texas as well. Those are the purple circles on the right side. So, in other words, going back to the Biobot for a minute, if we're looking at the regional on the 6-month basis, currently you see that big spike in the Northeast, but the Southeast is also going up, and the Midwest is going up, and the West is starting to go up as well. So as the XBB 1.5 spreads there, we can probably expect surges. And so this is going on at a staggered basis. So this is what's been kind of driving this plateau this whole year, which we'll show. This sort of plateau throughout the entire year, it's like one area surges, the others come down slightly, and overall it results in an average that for the entire country is pretty much sustained. So, but now it's surging and it's just going up and up. All right, let's finish with Ding here. All right, that's the one we were on. Go into this one. So how is XBB 1.5 surging in the UK? Suddenly it went from 0% to 4.3% in just 1 week. Now we've seen a lot of different variants emerge and take off. 0 to 4.3 in a week is a very fast takeoff. Expect it to be double digits next week. That's a huge increase. A lot of other variants have not done that. Also new, it seems that XBB has been found in China. The sequencing data submitted by scientists there, not by the government, shows that XBB1 is close to 10% in Shanghai, but it's unclear yet if it's XBB 1.5. If it is XBB 1.5, it is so fast it could swamp out any other new China variant. So you can see there on the chart, BF7 is the blue, the dark blue, BA5.2 is the orange, BQ11 is the gray, XBB1 is the yellow. So, yeah, that's just not a good situation. All right, now moving on to the second thing, and then we'll go back to the chat in the sort of breaking stuff. So this is the guy that he was talking about, Rajnarayan, and we've seen him quoted in other things. He runs a COVID variant dashboard, which we'll get the link for in one of these tweets. So this is from yesterday. Interesting tug of war between BQ 1.1 and XBB 1.5. Top lineages, and this is 15-day trends, so over the last 2 weeks. There's 14.7% BQ11, 11.4% XBB 1.5. Two wide eyes next to that because that is a big increase. BQ1 is at 10.7%. Basically, out of 6 of these, 4 of them are BQ. There's BQ11, BQ1, BQ122, and BQ113. So that XBB is growing rapidly. All right, so this is from the thing, and you see a nice little diagram there. That's the variant dashboard. With the larger the circle, the greater the amount of that strain. Sequence count by state. So California, New York, and Texas have submitted a huge share of sequences with specimen collection dates in the last 15 days. It appears like a tug of war between XBB 1.5 and BQ11, mainly because the number of sequences uploaded from the West and the South. You can see California, New York, Texas, North Carolina, Nebraska, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Connecticut, DC, Arizona, represented in the upper half of the chart there. couple more charts. I'll just throw those up for reference here. And so CDC updated variant proportions estimates on 12/23. That was a week ago. CDC updates nowcast estimates every Friday. That's when they're published. Several BQ strains are circulating at above 1%, and XBB.1.5 are good candidates to be included in them next week, since XBB is so much on the rise at this point. Top global lineages with at least 5 key convergent spike mutations. This is a 30-day or month trend. And again, half of these are BQ, but you've also got XBB1 and XBB.1.5 in there, as well as a CH strain and a BN strain. There are so many strains now. Like, these need new letters, you know what I mean? But they're just still treating them like Omicron. So predicted immune escape, this is what the same kind of chart we were looking at before. Predicted immune escape and the ACE2 binding of top lineages in the USA relative to BA2. The bivalent boosters, which contain the original strain and BA5, will potentially protect the boosted from getting severe disease and hospitalization. So please get boosted ASAP. And there's the link. It's public.tableau, tableau.com. And that's the app that has all this like advanced variant tracking. So here, this is that predicted immune escape, and I'll end it here, versus the ACE2 binding relative to BA2. Now you can see the blue dot in the upper right-hand corner. That is XBB.1.5. So the x-axis, the further to the right it is, the more capable it is of infecting cells. XBB is like 70-80% of the way across. So it's very high up there. There's only a few strains that are more infectious than it is, including BN 3.1 and basically most of the BN strains. There's a BL1 and there's a BA 2.755. But none are nearly as high up in the predicted immune escape. It's basically almost the highest in its infectiousness or ACE2 binding, and it's also one of the highest in its predicted immune escape. So this is, again, compare that to the earlier BA strain, or the XBB strain, I mean, that was in Singapore. So if we go back to Ding's thing, I think this was slide number 5 from Ding. Yeah, that's the one that we were looking at. This is the original XBB. You can see it was very high, the blue circle, on the escape from immunity side, but it wasn't as infectious. Now it's the same thing, but it is moved over much further to the right. So really bad news. I've got 2 more slides from this guy, and then we'll go back into the chat. XBB.1.5 is the top circulating lineage in New York. That is that blue circle, and that is not good news because it's a very severe strain. Recombinant lineage hotspots, 15-day trends in the U.S. It is sprouting everywhere, not just in the Northeast USA. So this is what we looked at before. New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, California, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Texas, Rhode Island, Maryland, and Virginia, as well as New Hampshire, and Massachusetts are like the top 10 or top 12. So that's what we got. That's some breaking news there. Now, we're going to chat for a bit, take just a quick moment of a break, and then we will get into the rest of the articles that have been piling up. There is so much to cover on this, and it's just not getting covered almost anywhere. So that's why we're doing so GD much of it here. All right, what do we have for comments? So yeah, the people going into work sick, somebody says, that's what made me start wearing a secure click to work instead of an Aura, even though it's socially alienating. Yeah, the Aura is a popular 3M N95 mask. Nobody's wearing masks in my country. 0. What country is that? I'm literally about to walk into Kroger, a grocery store, and I'll count the amount wearing masks. It's making me feel like I'm the crazy one. In my case, it would just be me. Sometimes a cashier wears one too, otherwise nothing. In Delaware, it's 1 to 2 per 100 people wearing masks. But when you drive 40 minutes away to Philly, sometimes it's 1 in 3. Different world. Capitalism is on borrowed time in many ways. And then I guess down in Mexico, here it's like 1 in 9,000. I mean, neoliberalization is embodied very plainly in how Elon Musk thinks that cutting costs is how you run a business in itself. It's the cannibalization of everything for the sake of finance capital. My friend just caught COVID in a trip with his family, and when he was on the road, he said that there was virtually 0 people with masks or hand gel. Not even at restrooms where at least the convenience stores would give you some gel for cleaning. Here in Mexico, a new wave of influenza and cold cases are on the rise along with COVID, and nobody, not even the anti-AMLO right-wing media, is saying a single thing about returning to safe distancing, masks, and containment policies. Reply, yes, they don't care about the Mexican people. The PRIAN alliance is 2 neoliberalist parties united against the Morena government, which is much the same, just more social programs, and even that is considered too far left. Haha. Let alone the militarization of even CDMX and the Bajío, etc. If Biden lost, would liberals still have gone along with this shit, just letting the government allow mass death for fucking business owners? Since Biden, their anger at power is all gone. This happened under Obama as well. I'm not going to say that, like, oh, it's better when Republicans are in there. There are definitely some demonstrable cases where the Democrats are better as the opposition, and we're going to use that term advisedly, opposition in quotes, power. They can at least pretend to oppose the Democrats better. But you find out what they're really about when they actually get power. They act the same because they work for the same people. The same basic industries fund both parties. It's like, we did a thing on this, a month or two ago, maybe a month and a half ago. Oh yeah, well, it's the time of the election. So yeah, it was about 2 months ago. We did a breakdown from OpenSecrets.org of the top industries funding the top Democrat, like the 10 top Democrats and the 10 top Republicans. And they were virtually the same. It was like a few of the things were in different slots. And like the Democrats had 3 things, I think, that the Republicans didn't have at all, which was like teachers, public sector employees, and like some unions. And then the Republicans had like forestry, railroads, and transportation and building materials. Otherwise, like the top 25 were virtually identical, just changed the position of like one was number 3 and over here it was number 4. Or like one was number 9, but here's number 12. Otherwise, it's like identical. So yeah, not major differences. Some differences, but they're slight overall. But yeah, I agree with you. Democrats get in line. This is why if the U.S. left doesn't separate itself from the Democratic Party, there's no fucking hope. Okay? And that's step 1. Like I said, there's kind of 2 modes to the U.S. left. Supporting the Democratic Party and trying to reform it. And 2, doing nothing at all. And then 3, there's like the handful of people like us who actually move into the real left. And, as I've said before, which has been commonly misunderstood, but let me say it again, I would rather people at least join the Green Party than continually cling to the Democrats, because it would at least be some leftward movement. You'd at least get into a party that doesn't take all that capitalist money. And would your struggle be super effective? It would be better than this, and you would figure out what does and what doesn't work in terms of, the Green Party is not Democratic centralist, and there's a variety of problems there. But, the right wing is terrible. The right wing of the Greens is super contrarian, the sort of, grifting opportunist populist type of people that we come up against a lot, including a lot of anti-vax people. So the right wing of the Greens is awful. The bottom line is, the U.S. left, does it exist? It's a handful of people who are barely organized. Our parties suck. And part of why our parties suck is the overall level of struggle is low. And people just either stay in the Democratic Party or don't do anything at all. That's really got to change. So, we need to see people vacating the Democratic Party and then doing something else organized. Again, I don't think the Green Party is going to be the party to end all parties for the U.S., What I am saying is it would probably be a positive step forward on the way to something better. The US left collectively needs to improve its collective intelligence and current body of knowledge. Already, we see the lessons learned from like Bernie are receding into the past, and the lessons learned from Occupy, the successes, let's try that again, the successes and the failures of Occupy, the successes and failures of Bernie, both of which happened in the post 2008 really intense period of capitalist crisis. They're receding into the past. You can't, like, people have the shortest fucking memory in this country. And we need to build momentum, not let it dissipate. And that's exactly what's happening right now as, the quote left either goes contrarian and starts watching Tucker Carlson, or it sidles up, alongside Vosh in the Democratic Party and starts, like Kyle Kalinske recently said, Biden is the best president of his lifetime and not as bad as he expected. How do you think anything is going to change here? So, yeah, that's enormously frustrating. I've been doing this channel for 3 years. We started out at a moment of much greater momentum for the US left. I have just watched that steadily shrink back into the margins. It's fucking depressing because what we need to do is have something like the Bernie moment where people were rallying by the stadium full in cities across the United States for left-wing causes. But we need to do it outside the Democratic Party. And if it started even with the Greens, I think a left coalition is more likely because all of the parties are small. But whatever, it needs to happen again, rally all the people again, where people are coming out and excited and there's juice, there's momentum, there's flow, but not involving the steel trap dead end of the Democratic Party, which is dominated by capital, is not a suitable space for proletarian organizing or strategizing class consciousness, strategizing class struggle, growing class consciousness through study and experience. You can't do that within the Democratic Party. You can't do that within the Democratic Party. So, but already, that was like going on 3 years ago, the sort of last Bernie rallies. And what have we had in the meantime? All that energy just sort of fading away. Well, again, I've called for a left coalition, and I've made that case before. Moving on. In Mexico, you have two types of neoliberal, the blatant sellout comprador ones, PRI, and the patriotic neoliberal, who claims to serve the interests of the Mexican people, and by people they mean rich people, with a slight nationalistic Mexico lindo sentiment so that we can compete against the US or EU countries. Morena, PRD, PT, and Movimiento Ciudadano. Sorry, reading is a challenge today. I've been streaming too much. Ciudadano fell in this later category. Lamau, they could fund Social Security forever at a rate beating inflation in one budget bill, but they keep using it to make the Democrats cede ground to the Republicans. Back in Mexico, the Mexico Lindo camp think tourism, Tren Maya, for example, will resolve issues. I work with PCM Sol Rojo and PCM ML. It's true, AMLO keeps on saying how wonderful the Tren Maya will be while cutting public spending and committing ethnic displacements of Mayan people. A total wonderful thing for sure. Lol. I know Sol Rojista and the EPR. I don't know much about PCM ML, but I'm willing to learn more about them. Oh, and not to mention all the new ancient Mayan artifacts and sites that have been found and are at the risk of being wiped out with the Tren Maya project. Capitalism erasing culture and history. Who would have guessed it? Yeah, 1776, aka the Great American Counter-Revolution. The fact that so many people traveled for both Thanksgiving and Christmas and even for New Year's still means that the numbers will go up immensely soon enough. Yeah, we don't even really have those numbers in fully yet. Especially now with everyone stuck at the airports trying to fly Southwest. That's not helping either. And the airports stopped supplying masks and the like. Yeah. Not big Trump fans here. Yeah, no, for sure. Nobody's a Trump fan here. The right wing of the Democrats, well, I don't know. Democrats are a huge party. there are many different factions. In the end, they all stand for basically the wrong things. The Democrats have terrible understanding in the end of any of the issues that they're facing. So yeah, you're just never going to see anything useful out of that party. The same talk and the we can't vote Democrat crowd. Oh, no. No, my poor misguided friend. You know who gave us Bush? The Democrats. Al Gore couldn't win his home state. You're talking about two parties that are just neck and neck as far as which one is more hated at any particular time. If the Democrats actually wanted to defeat the Republicans, they could ally with the left and crush the Republican Party. They have consistently refused to do this time and again. They talk about the rising threat of fascism, which they're collaborating with rather than helping to stamp out. They just fundraise off of it. That's all they do. You're a fucking idiot. If you're still on this like lesser evil, oh no, if the left breaks away, you're in the wrong place. You're in the wrong place. Who is Al Gore? Yeah, there you go. That was sarcastic, but all right. So let us get back into the COVID content. We're going to be starting with basically an overview of the highlights of long COVID, trying to, reiterate to people the actual risks of long COVID. Where's my monitor? So here's some of the things. So this is from CIDRAP, the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy at the University of Minnesota. Persistent brain fog and hair loss highlighted in long COVID studies. This is from July. 2 new studies describe long COVID symptoms, with one finding that 53% of hospitalized COVID-19 patients still had cognitive impairment or brain fog, read brain damage, 13 months after infection. Let's read that again. 53% of hospitalized COVID-19 patients still had cognitive impairment 13 months after infection. So again, like we said, if you get hospitalized, your odds of long COVID go up dramatically. And this includes brain damage, which has really noticeable day-to-day effects. Even if you're fully vaccinated and you're not hospitalized, your odds of long COVID are like 1 in 6. So it's still substantial. And another adding conditions such as hair loss and sexual dysfunction to the list of persistent symptoms among outpatients. Severe COVID tied to higher risk in one area. The first study by University of Oslo researchers in Norway was published yesterday in Open Forum Infectious Diseases. The team used 4 computer-based cognitive tests from the Cambridge Neuropsychological Test Automated Battery to assess 75 adult COVID-19 patients' cognitive function 13 months after release from a single hospital. Included patients were on average 55.7 years old and were admitted to the hospital up to June 2020. So we're not talking about, 75, 80, 90-year-old people, but people, basically middle-aged, not that old. The 4 tests were delayed matching to sample DMS, testing short-term memory, visuospatial processing, learning, and attention. The one-touch stockings of Cambridge OTS test for executive functioning. Rapid Visual Information Processing, RVP, for sustained attention, and Spatial Working Memory and Strategy, SWM. Rates of cognitive dysfunction were 25% on the DMS, 24% on the OTS, 21% on the RVP, and 14% on the SWM. Overall, 53% showed impairment on at least one of the 4 tests. Severe COVID-19, as evidenced by the receipt of supplementary oxygen, was associated with a higher likelihood of impaired cognition on the DMS only. Odds ratio 9.43. Adjusting for the presence of underlying diseases only slightly changed the ORs, odds ratios, and didn't affect the significance. So that is quite a spread, 1.54 to 57.74. However, even the bottom of the range is well above 1. So the researchers said that there may be several reasons behind the impairments, including causes other than COVID-19. It is possible that this could be explained by premorbid conditions, living in the epidemic, come on, or psychological sequelae. However, this could not be determined in the present study, they wrote. The findings should be ascertained in larger studies with even longer observation times. 62 symptoms linked to long COVID. In the second study, published earlier this week in Nature Medicine, a team led by University of Birmingham researchers retrospectively mined a UK-based primary care database to determine if outpatients had any of 115 COVID-related symptoms lasting longer than 12 weeks, as well as the risk factors for having lingering symptoms. The cohort included 486,149 adult COVID-19 survivors and almost 2 million matched uninfected controls from January 2020 to April 2021, before the Omicron SARS coronavirus 2 variant surge began. A total of 56.6% of COVID survivors tested positive in 2020, and 43.4% did so in 2021. Overall, 4.5% of survivors and 4.7% of controls had received at least one dose of the vaccine before the index date. The most common ones were Pfizer and AstraZeneca. COVID-19 survivors were more likely than controls to report more than one symptom after 12 weeks from the index date. So one symptom, 5.6 versus 4.7, two symptoms, 3.6 versus 2.9, and three or more, 4.9 versus 4.0. 62 symptoms were significantly linked to long COVID, with the largest adjusted hazard ratios, AHRs, for loss of smell, AHR 6.49, hair loss 3.99, sneezing 2.77, ejaculation difficulty 2.63, and reduced libido 2.36. Among COVID-19 survivors, the risk factors for long COVID included female sex, so women tend to get long COVID more, we don't know why, younger age, non-white ethnicity, socioeconomic deprivation, smoking, obesity, and a wide range of underlying illnesses. The most common associated underlying conditions were chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, enlarged prostate, fibromyalgia, anxiety, erectile dysfunction, depression, migraine, multiple sclerosis, celiac disease, and learning disability. These ranged from 1.55 down to 1.24. The most common symptoms were loss of smell, shortness of breath, chest pain, fever, amnesia, apraxia, or the impaired ability to perform familiar movements or commands. That's a bit scary. Bowel incontinence, also not fun. Erectile dysfunction, hallucinations, and swelling of the arms or legs. This research validates what patients have been telling clinicians and policymakers throughout the pandemic, that the symptoms of long COVID are extremely broad and cannot be fully accounted for by other factors, such as lifestyle risk factors or chronic health conditions. Senior author Shamil Haroon of the University of Birmingham said in a university news release, "The symptoms we identified should help clinicians and clinical guideline developers to improve the assessment of patients with long-term effects from COVID-19, and to subsequently consider how the symptom burden can be best managed." So what would be great is annual physical includes a long COVID, rundown. The researchers called for research into the natural history of long COVID, characterization of persistent symptom clusters, and clinical outcomes. Further research is also needed to understand the health and social impacts of these persistent symptoms, to support patients living with long-term sequelae, and to develop targeted treatments, they concluded. So there's always the call for those things, but we've read articles from people suffering from long COVID who are participating in these programs, and they're just not getting as far as, they're not really getting anywhere so far, not very far. All right, so this is a preprint. This is profiling post-COVID syndrome across different variants of SARS coronavirus 2 by Canas et al. So this is from, what's the date? Where is the date? I'm not seeing the date. Anyway, basically what they found here is that different variants are producing different long COVID profiles. So what we're going to get, because what's happening is there's a new dominant strain like every few months now. So we're going to get different profiles of long COVID probably. So anyway, let's read. The abstract. Background. Self-reported symptom studies rapidly increased our understanding of SARS coronavirus 2 during the pandemic and enabled the monitoring of long-term effects of COVID-19 outside the hospital setting. It is now evident that post-COVID syndrome presents with heterogeneous profiles, which means different profiles, which need characterization to enable personalized care among the most affected survivors. This study describes post-COVID profiles and how they relate to different viral variants and vaccination status. Methods. In this prospective longitudinal cohort study, we analyzed data from 336,652 subjects with regular health reports through the COVID Symptom Study CSS smartphone application. These subjects had reported feeling physically normal for at least 30 days before testing positive for SARS coronavirus 2. 9,323 individuals subsequently developed long COVID, defined as symptoms lasting longer than 28 days. 1,459 had post-COVID syndrome, defined as more than 12 weeks of symptoms. Clustering analysis of the time series data was performed to identify distinct symptom profiles for post-COVID patients across variants of SARS coronavirus 2 and vaccination status at the time of infection. Clusters were then characterized based on symptom prevalence, duration, demography, and prior conditions or comorbidities, co-occurring sicknesses. Using an independent testing sample with additional data, 140 in the sample set, we investigated the impact of post-COVID symptom clusters on the lives of affected individuals. So the findings, we identified distinct profiles of symptoms for post-COVID syndrome within and across variants. 4 endotypes were identified for infections due to the wild-type variant, 7 for the alpha variant, 5 for delta. Across all variants, a cardiorespiratory cluster of symptoms was identified. A second cluster related to central neurological, that's your central nervous system, and a third to cases with the most severe and debilitating multi-organ symptoms. Gastrointestinal symptoms clustered in no more than 2 specific phenotypes per viral variant. The 3 main clusters were confirmed in an independent testing sample, and their functional impact was assessed. Interpretation. Unsupervised analysis identified different post-COVID profiles, characterized by differing symptom combinations, durations, and functional outcomes. Phenotypes were at least partially concordant or in agreement with individuals' reported experiences. Our classification may be useful to understand distinct mechanisms of the post-COVID syndrome, as well as subgroups of individuals at risk of prolonged debilitation. So they have some of the information here, but you get the idea. We have a lot to cover, so I'm going to move on through this. But basically, you're getting different symptom clusters out of different strains of COVID. So how this changes in the future, we really don't know yet. There's another article here that I want to at least mention, long-term neurologic outcomes of COVID-19. It is far too long to go over in detail, but this was published on the 22nd of September, so it's pretty recent. And so the abstract, the neurologic manifestations of acute COVID-19 are well characterized, but a comprehensive evaluation of post-acute, you know what that means, after the acute phase, neurologic sequelae are consequences like a sequel, at 1 year has not been undertaken. So they're trying to do a comprehensive evaluation of what's long COVID doing at 1 year out from infection. Here we use the national healthcare databases of the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs to build a cohort of over 150,000 individuals with COVID-19, 5.6 million contemporary controls, and 5.9 million historical controls. We use inverse probability weighting to balance the cohorts and estimate risks and burdens of incident neurologic disorders at 12 months following acute SARS coronavirus 2 infection. Our results show that in the post-acute phase of COVID-19, there was an increased risk of an array of incident neurologic sequelae, including ischemic and hemorrhagic stroke, cognition and memory disorders, peripheral nervous system disorders. So that would be your nervous system outside the central nervous system, like brain and spine. Episodic disorders, for example, migraine and seizures, where you don't get the symptoms all the time, but in episodes. You'll have an incidence of migraine and then a period of not having a migraine, or you'll have a seizure and then not have a seizure for a while. Extrapyramidal and movement disorders, mental health disorders, musculoskeletal disorders, sensory disorders, Guillain-Barré syndrome, and encephalitis or encephalopathy. We estimated that the hazard ratio of any neurologic sequela was 1.42, 95%, etc., and burden 70.69 per 1,000 persons at 12 months. So, okay, the burden, 71 per 1,000 persons at 12 months. The risks and burdens were elevated even in people who did not require hospitalization during acute COVID-19. Limitations include a cohort comprising mostly white males. Taken together, our results provide evidence of increased risk of long-term neurologic disorders in people who had COVID-19. So this is focusing specifically on just the neurological problems with COVID-19. I will mention one of the researchers there, Ziad Al-Ali, is quoted in a number of other studies that we've read here. So this is kind of a long article. I will link to it as I link to the rest of them. I would love to read more of this. We unfortunately just don't have time, but I would recommend this one. Actually, as we go through it, there's a number of, let me see if I can, damn it, that was the same one. There's a number of good charts. So they do a breakdown here, cerebrovascular disorders, cognition and memory, and they do the specific risk of each of those, how it's affected or raised by long COVID. More here. So again, if you want to pause it and read this, I did skip a little bit in the article, but again, you can pause the video and take a look if you want. I'm trying to get to the pictures though. So there is a subgroup analysis of the risks of incident post-acute COVID-19 composite neurological outcomes compared with the control cohort, the contemporary control cohort. And let's just read there. The risks of incident composite neurological outcomes were evident in all subgroups based on age, race, sex, obesity, smoking, area deprivation index, diabetes, chronic kidney disease, hyperlipidemia, hypertension, and immune dysfunction. So no matter what group you're in, the risks were evident in all of these groups. Let's continue there. I know there's another couple of nice pictures in this one. There we go. Risks and 12-month burdens of incident post-acute COVID-19 neurologic outcomes compared with the contemporary control cohort by care setting of the acute infection. So this breaks it down by whether you were non-hospitalized, hospitalized, or hospitalized in the ICU. And you can see that the hospitalization increases the risk every single time in the ICU, higher than that. And this is across all these categories: cerebrovascular, cognition, memory, peripheral nerves, episodic disorders, and so on, including mental health disorders, and so on. But anyway, let's move on, although I, again, recommend that article. There is also, as I mentioned before, there's a number of good Twitter accounts doing research on this. I want to link to this thread and just recommend it, mention it. From @MeetJess, we know by now that COVID affects the brain. One infection can do serious damage. What will happen after multiple infections? Quick thread on COVID and your brain. So there's another related thread, which I believe was linked in this, and we will provide a link to that too in the video description. Somebody else @Laurie Allee, so it's LAURIEALLEE, starting a thread on COVID and new onset psychosis. So number of articles and studies there about people developing psychosis after getting COVID, where they didn't have it before. I believe somebody in the chat here today developed seizures after COVID. Now, that's some neurological stuff. Let's look real quick. Something I don't think gets enough mention is kidney disease. So manifesting here as overactive bladder. That is definitely a quality of life impairing thing, but people who have severe COVID, it does a horrific number on your kidneys. Your kidneys both get directly infected and damaged by COVID. And also in the course of, your kidneys filter fluids and control your electrolyte balances. And there is, complex feedback loops involving your brain and the kidneys, as far as, keeping keeping your electrolytes and other levels of things in balance. So you need them. They're a vital organ. A new study finds that symptomatic COVID-19 infection, so not asymptomatic but symptomatic, is associated with the risk of developing or exacerbating overactive bladder symptoms. As an overlooked area of study, only a handful of investigations have focused on the impact of COVID-19 infection on the urinary system. Previous studies have found increased urinary tract symptoms, including the frequency, urgency, and waking up to urinate post-COVID-19 infection. They attributed the symptoms to inflammation and described the condition as COVID-associated cystitis, or CAC. Overactive bladder is characterized by a frequent and sudden urge to urinate that can be difficult to control. A person with an overactive bladder may experience urgent incontinence or unintentional loss of urine immediately after feeling an urgent need to urinate, as well as the need to urinate more than typically throughout the day and night. Anyway, this article, again, we'll link to that, describes what the researchers did. And so symptomatic individuals with COVID-19 had noticeably higher rates of worsening or developing new overactive bladder symptoms compared to asymptomatic participants and those who tested negative. Following systematic analysis, Roberts and colleagues found that participants previously symptomatic with COVID-19 infection, so they previously had an infection, had a 36.6% incidence of developing COVID-associated cystitis, that's bladder inflammation, with 22% of the group developing overactive bladder. So that's 1 in 5 within that group. So you have basically 1 in 3 getting the COVID-associated cystitis, and then 1 in 5 within that 1 in 3 developing overactive bladder. This is definitely a quality of life impairment for sure. So I'll put the other 2 screenshots here on the screen. You can pause it if you need, but this is one that definitely gets overlooked, is kidney and urinary system damage. Now let's move on to children and long COVID, and this is going to kind of segue us into another section on children, which won't just be about long COVID, but about kids and COVID in general, because we've constantly been told, like, oh, kids aren't as great of a risk, and that's true in some senses, but well, as we can see right here from CIDRAP, kids are at similar risk for long COVID as adults, study suggests. This is from just last month, November 10. A large study today from Germany shows that kids and adolescents are at the same relative risk of experiencing COVID-19 symptoms 90 days or more after acute infection as adults are, according to findings in PLOS Medicine. By the way, so we see different definitions of long COVID. That's why you're seeing different different rates being represented. So is it 28 days after infection? Is it 90 days after infection? Different standards. There's no one set definition for this. And a new systematic review by researchers from the World Health Organization in the same journal shows that likely 2/3 of the world's population has SARS-CoV-2 antibodies. So about 1/3 of kids and adults have long COVID. Though kids and adolescents have far fewer deaths or severe outcomes from acute COVID-19 infections compared to adults, little is known about long or post-COVID symptoms in this age group, or symptoms that persist for more than 12 weeks after acute infection. Researchers from the Technical University of Dresden, Germany, used data from half the German population to determine that kids and adults have the same relative risk of experiencing post-COVID symptoms at 90 days following infection. The study was based on I've seen videos of kids like out of the UK that like can't walk anymore after getting COVID. So this is definitely a problem to take note of. The study was based on medical records of those with COVID-19 infections confirmed by PCR testing in all of 2020 in Germany. The authors compared the occurrence of pre-specified diagnoses entered into the medical record at least 3 months post-infection in COVID-19 patients to a control cohort of more than 75,000 people, or 750,000 people with matched age, sex, and pre-existing medical conditions without PCR-confirmed COVID-19. So it goes on and on. Kids and teens with COVID were 30% more likely than controls to have documented health problems 3 months or more after COVID-19 infection than the COVID-negative controls. Adults with COVID-19, by comparison, were 33% more likely than controls to have health problems in the same time frame. Martin Ressler, PhD, the lead author of the study, said that there were significant symptom overlaps between kids and adults who experienced symptoms 90 days or more after acute infection. Quote, "We found 5 identical outcomes among the 10 outcomes with the highest relative risk among children, adolescents, and adults. These symptoms are cough, fever, headache, malaise, fatigue, and exhaustion, and throat or chest pain," he told SIDRAP News. Other symptoms were more commonly seen in adults but not kids. These included a loss of taste or smell, fever, and shortness of breath. Kids tend to get better. Daniel Blatt, MD, a pediatric infectious disease physician at the post-COVID clinic at Norton Children's Hospital in Louisville, Kentucky, said he was not surprised by the study's findings. It's unclear if long COVID is the same in children and adults in terms of the pathophysiology, the disease process that's happening in your physiology. But it's just as real, Blatt said. Blatt, who was not involved in the study, said that his clinic also collects data on children and long COVID. He said that the most common symptoms reported in his patients are fatigue, anxiety, and brain fog, aka brain damage, cognitive impairment, followed by some shortness of breath or muscle pain. The good news is kids tend to get better regardless of what intervention is needed, Blatt said. As in adult long COVID, there's no one-size-fits-all approach for pediatric long COVID patients. Some need reassurance, some need a graduated exercise, physical therapy program. Blatt said that for all pediatric long COVID cases, families need to be heard, that what their child is experiencing is real and serious. So anyway, the article goes on here. I'll put the rest of it up on the screen for you. There's one more page. So I can hear some people saying, well, some of these studies are done on the 2020 and 2021 strains. Yeah, that's true. And what we already know about those strains is bad enough. So this is part of the don't fuck around and you don't have to find out aspect of this. We're dealing with a novel virus where we're learning on the fly, and good science comes out 6 to 8 months after the end of the phenomenon, by the time the virus has already evolved into something else. So you see, what we know can't keep up in real time with the newly emerging conditions, because the newly emerging conditions are literally happening minute by minute, day by day. So we don't, and we're also in a situation now where, kids had the same relative risk of getting long COVID from the earlier strains. And now what's going to happen when we're on the basis of everyone's just expected to get infected 3 or 4 times a year? So yeah. COVID-19 and children, what we know. That's why our friend, William A. Hazeltine, he's not actually my friend, but I like his articles. Let us continue. This is from November 30, so just a month ago, very recent. Less is known about the impact of COVID-19 infection among children compared to adults. Why do children experience milder symptoms on average compared to adults during the acute phase? Do children experience long COVID, and what makes them different? What is MIS-C, and what is its prevalence? So MIS-C is multi-system inflammatory syndrome in children. A recent perspective published by Science explores current research and provides answers to these questions. So why can COVID-19 be milder in children? There are several theories as to why COVID-19 can be milder in children. One explanation is that a child's innate immune system mounts a more vigorous attack at the onset of infection. A child's acquired immunity changes throughout life and is found to be initially less extensive compared to adults. In particular, some studies have found that children have weaker memory T cells and lower neutralizing and, not sure what that is, receptor activating responses compared to adults. So this is Fc gamma receptors, or is that another Greek letter? Anyway, I'm not familiar with that one. These play a critical role in triggering the adapted immune system, and a lower activation provides a less robust cell immunity response. Additionally, cytokine interferon levels, which are heavily involved with inflammation, have been found to be age-dependent. A study on mucosal, and that's what was a chart of innate and adaptive immune cell types. A study on mucosal responses at the time of COVID-19 diagnosis found that RNA sequencing data and measurement of cytokines had a much more brisk response in the nasal mucosa of children compared to adults. So you have mucosal membranes lining things like your mouth and nose and other parts of your body with similar textures which can interface with the outside world. The mucus is there partly as just a line of physical defense. Things like a spider web, things that get trapped in there can be discarded by your body more easily rather than getting into your cells. So they found that the nasal mucosa of children, it tends to mount a more rapid response than adults do. So it may not be able to penetrate, the infection may not be able to penetrate as deeply. This finding can possibly be attributed to the trained immunity resulting from more frequent respiratory infections in children, which increases the baseline or standard innate activity in children. The developing nature of a child's acquired immune system is also hypothesized to contribute to mild cases. Studies have found that children have an increased frequency of naive T cells, fewer natural killer cells, and lower frequency of cytotoxic T cells compared to adults. Additionally, the T cell receptor declined clonal expansion among children who were previously infected by COVID-19 compared to adults. Why do some children develop MIS-C? Multisystem inflammatory syndrome in children is a post-COVID infection condition where different systems of the body become inflamed. It can be seen in children 6 to 12 years old and occur within 3 to 6 weeks following COVID-19 infection. MIS-C symptoms include fever, atypical fatigue, red eyes, strong abdominal pain, severe or worsening vomiting or diarrhea, and rashes. The underlying causes have yet to be identified, but current research finds that increased immune cells and cytokines are involved. Some studies have found increased activation of neutrophils, monocytes, T cells, B cells, natural killer cells, and dendritic cells, all of which regulate immune system function in patients with MIS-C. Additionally, there's higher frequency of cytokines, large proteins involved in pro- or anti-inflammatory factors, and chemokines, which are involved in inducing cell migration, meaning that the higher concentrations of cytokines and chemokines direct activated immune cells to inflamed organs, exacerbating the current state. Some patients with MIS-C have autoantibodies, or antibodies that attack self-antigens made by the body. There is insufficient evidence as of right now, however, to conclude whether autoantibodies occur as a result of the inflamed organ state or drive autoimmunity. So again, we're 3 years into this. We still don't know a lot of stuff about it. That's why it's a really bad idea to keep letting it spread. We just have no idea still some of the basic dimensions of what we're dealing with. If a child is suspected of having MIS-C, they should immediately seek medical care. In the U.S., roughly 3 in 10,000 people under the age of 21 were reported to have been diagnosed with a case of MIS-C infection. And there is an approximately 0.8% chance of mortality. MIS-C is a treatable condition with a high recovery rate. Healthcare providers may administer anti-inflammatory drugs to reduce inflammation in the body and protect vital organs from permanent damage. Studies have also found that COVID-19 vaccination as an effective means to reduce the risk of MIS-C, in part by reducing the risk of COVID-19 infections. That was not a complete sentence. Okay, that was my imagination. Becoming vaccinated also reduces the incidence rate of MIS-C. Long COVID in children and young people. Most children and adults fully recover from long COVID. However, some individuals may experience symptoms beyond the average recovery period. This condition is known as long COVID. So here they're talking about 3 to 4 weeks. Okay, and yes, most do fully recover. However, a substantial amount do get long COVID. At least 200 different symptoms of long COVID have been reported, and it has affected every organ system within the body. Depending on the methodology, cohort, and definition, global prevalence estimates of long COVID among children are between 1 in 4 and 1 in 100. In the UK alone, 120,000 children experienced long COVID in 2021, with 26,000 having symptoms persisting for more than a year. Children with long COVID can be grouped based on their ability to return to, quote, normal life and the presence of additional post-infectious complications. Children may experience debilitating symptoms, such as unexplained fever, fatigue, pain, cognitive difficulties, and post-exertional symptom exacerbation. So after you exert yourself, the symptoms get worse, that interfere with daily life activities. Some post-infectious complications include MIS-C, acute neurological disease, and myocarditis, heart inflammation, and can last a few weeks to many months past COVID-19 infection. And let me just add, in the UK alone, 120,000 children experienced long COVID in 2021. That was when better protections were still in place. Okay? There are currently no established biomarkers that can identify long COVID. However, we did cover a study where Boston researchers found that 60% of people experiencing long COVID had the spike protein in their system. 40% did not. So, but that may be a step towards identifying a biomarker. Anyway, the first research definition of long COVID was published this past July. We're finally just getting, diagnostic codes for, being able to mark long COVID in the system so that you can actually do studies on it. So this is how far behind it is. Anyway, it was first published this past July. In alignment with the clinical case definition released by the World Health Organization, it defined long COVID as a post-COVID infection condition with at least one physical symptom persisting 12 weeks past infection. It cannot be explained by an alternative diagnosis. A global agreement for a pediatric long COVID definition is expected in 2023. On a global front, we must work together and invest resources to understand the full implications of COVID-19 among children. In doing so, we can optimize treatments and create more effective therapies, enhancing recovery and reducing the prevalence of long COVID. They always say this, we're entering year 4, we don't really have these things yet. Now, a few other things I wanted to highlight as we move through the children's section. This thread by Dr. Deepti Gurdasani about pediatric hepatitis. We covered this earlier this year, but basically there is an increased incidence of pediatric hepatitis that seems to line up with the COVID rate, basically. And so you have to adjust it by 16 weeks, but that, is consistent with the timeline that you can see for immune-based conditions and other similar things. So putting some of the things here, I don't unfortunately have time to read through the whole thing, but again, wanted to blast this out. And next we're going to move on to damage to lungs. So this is another study out of CIDRAP, or press release out of CIDRAP. Some kids and teens have long-term lung damage after COVID-19. This is from September, just a few months ago. MRIs reveal lung damage in non-hospitalized children and teens who either had COVID-19 up to a year earlier or have long COVID symptoms, according to a single-center clinical trial published this week in Radiology. Researchers in Germany evaluated changes in lung structure and function in 54 pediatric COVID-19 survivors and 9 healthy controls aged 5 to 17 years using low-field MRI, which doesn't require children to hold their breath during imaging. Participants also contributed blood samples. The study was conducted from August to December 2021. 29 patients, or over half, 54%, had recovered from their infections. 25, or 46%, had long COVID, and all but 1 were unvaccinated at the time of infection. 4 COVID-19 patients had asymptomatic acute infections. The median interval between infection and study participation was 222 days, so about 2/3 of a year. Average patient age was 11 years, 44% were girls. Underlying conditions were identified in 22% of controls and 5% of recovered patients, and 10% of those with long COVID. So the overwhelming majority of those with long COVID did not have identified underlying medical conditions. So they go through, the specific tests that they ran. They came up with an unpredictable diagnostic odyssey. Quote, persistent symptoms after COVID still cause diagnostic odysseys. This is especially true for young people. So people are having symptoms and they're on this odyssey from doctor to doctor, test to test, trying to get a diagnosis for what's actually going on. And so the observed pulmonary dysfunction, pulmonary would be lung dysfunction in our study, is an unexpected finding because children develop a robust, cross-reactive, and sustained immune response after COVID. Yet these kids, observedly have the sustained lung damage. The researchers said that the COVID-19 associated direct damage to the lining of blood vessels, inflammation, and blood clot promoting environment may factor into the observed lung changes. The findings, they said, warrant heightened vigilance for persistent lung damage in the post-COVID pediatric population. Given the already existing diagnostic value of lung MRI and the translatability of the technology, these imaging approaches can be rapidly adopted to clinical routine care, they concluded. Another note here, again, this is on the COVID and young people front here. Want to note that there's an article here from ProPublica. Headline is, God No, Not Another Case. COVID-related stillbirths didn't have to happen. This is by Dua Eldaib. That is a small letter on my screen there. But I'll put a link to that, and you can look that up as well. Again, we don't really have time to go into it. But basically, there are, if you look at side-by-side pictures of, COVID placenta, if you will, there can be massive damage to the placenta, resulting in death to the fetus and stillbirth. So, moving on again. So, speaking of pregnancy and COVID, this is from Dr. Lisa Iannatone at Lisa_Iannatone, IANNATTONE, does a lot of COVID stuff, is a dermatologist, but has medical training and does a lot on COVID. In this study, babies born to mothers that were infected with COVID while pregnant were born with smaller lung volume than normal. By the way, Anthony J. Leonardi is the person I was saying that has the Italian name I was trying to remember and was blanking on the other day. Does a lot of COVID stuff as well at Fitter, Happier AJ. So, infants born to mothers who had COVID during gestation had smaller lungs right out of the gate. That is one of the things happening with this disease. In this study, several babies whose mothers were infected with COVID while pregnant secreted SARS coronavirus 2 in their stool after they were born, demonstrating they were infected in the womb and suggesting that they developed a persistent viral reservoir in the gut. Then there was this study that found that infants whose mothers were infected with COVID while pregnant had elevated inflammatory cytokines at birth with the potential to impact long-term infant health. And before you hand wave on stuff like this, what happens in the womb, is truly, formative and foundational to health. All kinds of health conditions get passed along, and this coming out of that environment, because that's as crucial. Milestones are reached, as you go from just a fertilized egg to a baby human capable of being born and surviving, breathing oxygen. There are crucial developmental pathways that are shut on or off. What happens in the womb is very important. So having that kind of inflammation going on is telling the baby what kind of environment they need to be adapting to. And of course, it's not, a conscious thing. They're not flipping the switches themselves, but their genetics are impacted by this. So again, some of the babies born with smaller lungs. What else is going to go on? We don't know yet. This is a novel virus. So please tell me again how the 7-fold increase in RSV hospitalization rate for 0 to 6 months old, 0 to 6 month olds is because we didn't expose pregnant women to pathogenic viruses enough while completely ignoring the elephant in the room. Pregnant women need to be protected from pathogens, not exposed to them. Just think about the implications if all these unexpectedly medically fragile infants are evidence of significant harm to infants born to mothers that were infected with COVID. We would either need to suppress community transmission or put all pregnant women on preventative leave. So you've got babies being born now with smaller lungs, and you've also got a big spike in infant hospitalization for respiratory syncytial virus right now. Now, we've talked about in older kids, this is probably because of, may likely well be due to immune impairment due to COVID. COVID harms your immune system. But we've also got kids being born with just smaller lungs. So, what is it? These are guesses at this point because the situation is evolving faster than we can study it. Given how incompatible both those options are with the current COVID is over party, I expect the possibility that prenatal, before birth, COVID infections may be harming infants to be downplayed or ignored this year. But the next post-pandemic RSV season in 2023 should be interesting indeed. So moving on from here into another study on newborns. This is published in Pediatric Research out of Nature. SARS coronavirus 2 detected in neonatal stool remote from maternal COVID-19 during pregnancy. So this was published in August. And this is the study that they were talking about before, where they investigated stool from 14 newborns, and they found basically COVID in the stool, and it was probably passed on by the mother. The nasal swabs were negative, so they didn't catch it from the air, they just had it in their bodies. So what is it like when your body is forming as an infant with COVID in it? Knowing all of the massive inflammatory damage and just the way that it impacts the immune system and everything else, the havoc that COVID can wreak on your system. That can't be good for, the absolutely most fragile early state of health, being an infant. So let's go on to the next article, kind of directly on this theme. Don't let them gaslight us about our children, especially during a pandemic. This is by Mitchell Abulafia, and this is from January. So this is 11 months ago when they were telling people to, just open the schools and all this kind of stuff. And there was a struggle going on over the supposed mental health toll of keeping kids out of school. My God, these are horrific figures. Quote, hospitalizations for all listed mental health conditions increased by nearly 50% among children aged 10 to 14 years, and by 21% for emergency department or ED visits. Inpatient visits for suicide, suicidal ideation, and self-injury increased by 104% for children aged 1 to 17 years, and by 151% for children aged 10 to 14 years during this period. End quote. Our children are in crisis. We have to get them back to school ASAP before any more damage is done. Oops, except these statistics are from 2006 to 2011, when kids were in school in person. But wait, there's more. Here's a graph of suicides for ages, and sorry, I forgot to mention, obviously, content warning. I don't mean to make light of that, but literally just forgot. And anyway, here's a graph of suicides for ages 10 to 24 from 2000 to 2017 based on CDC figures. Death by suicide is skyrocketing in young people. By the way, now that I've kind of blown that, anybody struggling with that, the pain that you're experiencing that is causing you to suffer from that, you have my full sympathy. And again, we're not making light of that. Hopefully, this discussion will help rather than hurt your understanding and make you feel less alone in that. The pain that people can experience emotionally, psychologically, can be really intense and can cause people to turn in on themselves and shut down. It's a terrible thing that can be brought on by any number of conditions, situational, biological, and it does need to be dealt with seriously. However, what we see in this case is it was being used as a bargaining chip to try to force people, kids, back into schools, and completely misrepresenting the data, as we'll see. So here's a graph of suicide for ages 10 to 24 from 2000 to 2017 based on CDC figures. Death by suicide is skyrocketing in young people. America's youth have been in a mental health crisis for years. It certainly didn't begin in the pandemic, although many politicians and media figures are all of a sudden terribly worried about mental health issues, which they didn't pay much attention to before the pandemic. They argue that there's been a dramatic decline in young people's mental health since the pandemic began, and they typically blame school closures for this problem. Gaslighting 101, Pandemic Youth Suicide Wave. Over the summer, as President Donald J. Trump was trying to strong-arm schools into reopening, Dr. Robert R. Redfield, then the CDC director, warned that a rise in adolescent suicides would be one of the substantial public health negative consequences of school closings, quoting the New York Times. Perhaps the most disturbing claim about young people circulating during the pandemic is that there has been a dramatic increase in suicides, but it never happened, and it was all hype. Tom Bartlett establishes this in his essay, The Suicide Wave That Never Was. Quote, President Joe Biden asserted not long ago that suicides are up. You'll hear the same presented as fact by news anchors, politicians on both sides of the aisle, and, as I did recently, on your neighborhood listserv. But the evidence supporting a broad, pandemic-driven suicide crisis among teens, or adults for that matter, was always a narrative in search of data. Unquote. But you don't have to take Bartlett's word for it about teens and suicide. Here's the CDC's language, which breaks down the rate by age, and it includes preteens. Quote, although suicide rates for persons aged 10 to 14, 15 to 24, and 25 to 34 increased between 2019 and 2020, only the 5% increase for those aged 25 to 34 from 17.5 to 18.3% was significant. And even from 17.5 to 18.3 was significant. And even this is a bit misleading because the non-significant increase in suicides of 10 to 24-year-olds between 2019 and 2020 took place after a dip in 2019. So it lowered first, then it increased. So, and not necessarily a net increase. So the increase was relative to a year in which there was a dip. And this dip appears to be unusual in relationship to the preceding years. In other words, 2019's dip looks like it may prove to be the outlier, not 2020's non-significant increase. Here's the longer view. So, by the way, what is significant? What does that mean in this case? So if something is not statistically significant, it may have just occurred by chance. And so there's particular math that you can do to determine whether a change is statistically significant or not. If it's statistically significant, then it was very unlikely to have occurred by chance. If it's not statistically significant, then you can't tell if it was just caused by chance or not. So that's what the dip was. It was kind of a random chance, maybe a plateau, but not statistically significant. Quote, the suicide rate among adolescents and young adults aged 10 to 24 in the United States increased 57.4% from 6.8 per 100,000 in 2007 to 10.7 in 2018. This is well before the pandemic, quoting the CDC. That there wasn't a large increase in suicides among young Americans during the pandemic is somewhat surprising because of the range of serious emotional, physical, and financial challenges that young people and their families had to face. But even if there had been a large increase, it still wouldn't have proven that school closures were responsible. There are many other possible causes. And as we shall see, there is a good reason to be suspicious about anyone claiming that there's a link between school closures and increased suicides. So I'm going to pause here. Again, this is a longer article. I will link to it. This particular fight has already been lost, right? The schools are open. People have pretty much given up fighting for school closures, no matter how bad COVID gets. And that battle was won by the reopen the schools side, based in part on this erroneous claim, which was repeated far and wide. But as this article breaks down, it was a bunch of bullshit on its face. Even if there was an increase, it wasn't necessarily because of the school closures, and so on. So they go through a lot of actually very good points in this article, and I would recommend reading it. We will link to it there. They're just, as I said before, is literally so much on COVID. You can't cover it all. I could do hours and hours every single day and not get to all of it. But yeah, most of what's being reported is just terrible. Let's end our kids section before we move to more of a wrap up with this sad note. 10.5 million children were orphaned or lost a primary caregiver due to COVID so far, study finds. They forgot the so far part. This is by Katie Stanton, USA Today. This was published September 6. Worldwide, an estimated 10.5 million children were either orphaned or lost a primary caregiver due to COVID-19, according to a study published Tuesday. The study in JAMA Pediatrics examined the World Health Organization's data on excess mortality as of May 2022, finding that the majority of those children, 7.5 million, were orphaned, while 3 million children lost a primary caregiver. Study authors urged public officials to address the lasting impacts of grief on children who've lost caretakers to the virus, in addition to vaccines and prevention. Quote, effective, caring action to protect children from immediate and long-term harms of COVID-19 is an investment in the future and a public health imperative, the paper said. So contrast this with the last article. What are we actually getting? We're getting effective, caring action? No, we're getting gaslighting kids to shoehorning them back into schools. Children experiencing orphanhood or caregiver loss face an increased likelihood of poverty, abuse, and mental health challenges, among other obstacles, according to the Centers for Disease. Quote, COVID is not just an individual disease, it really is a family disease, said Terry Powell, an associate professor of American health at Johns Hopkins University who was not involved in the study. They're not just people that died, but parents and caregivers. How do we make sure that there's still a safety net for the kids who are their surviving children? More children were affected by caregiver loss in Africa and Southeast Asia compared to Europe and North and South America. The study did not break down totals for individual countries, but it noted that children were most affected in India, Indonesia, Egypt, Nigeria, and Pakistan. Closing it out. In fall 2021, an American Academy of Pediatrics study estimated at least 140,000 children across the U.S. had lost a primary or secondary caregiver to COVID-19. That number has since risen to at least 209,000 children, according to a calculator from Imperial College London. The AAP study also found significant racial disparities, as we see across everything with COVID, among children affected, with children of color accounting for 65% of children orphaned from COVID-19 through June 2021. Recognizing these disparities is key in addressing future health crises, but also for providing care to children impacted by COVID-19 that is trauma-informed and culturally relevant, as grief is individually unique, Powell told USA Today. Quote, how are we making sure that they have access to additional resources that they may not even have considered before, she said. How are we thinking about what we can learn from social workers about keeping families together and supporting brand new parents? In the U.S., grandparents, aunts, cousins, kinship caregivers are often stepping into the void created by the loss of a caregiver, but they face challenges from a lack of training in how to help a child dealing with trauma, to financial and resource challenges from adding a new member to their household. The California legislature is considering a bill that would establish trust fund accounts for children whose parent or guardian died from COVID-19. The JAMA, Journal of the AMA Pediatrics study, utilized excess mortality-derived estimates from the WHO, The Economist, and the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation. So thus ends our kids section. I'm going to check in with the chat, and then we will go to our masks, vaccines, and wrap-up section. And this is a super long stream today, but that's what we're doing. All right. Now, where were we in the chat? All right, there we go. Yeah, just on the whole Democrat-Republican thing before, you get Pelosi and Biden, we need a strong Republican Party. At the same time, the threat of fascism is rising. It's not serious at all. So, some people not understanding things. If the average age is 55 years, then the conditions sound pretty normal. Was there any control? Yes. So, I don't know if you missed that part, but yes. I mean, we've been covering the long COVID stuff for like a year and a half now. There's not really any question about this stuff. It's very, very well established at this point. Cuba was also taking the pandemic very seriously. They were even sending doctors to people's homes. Sounds so surreal for me to hear of such thing here in Mexico. And Cuba is 5 times smaller than Mexico, yet they managed to do it. Still, the quote, few cases of severe COVID prove that this isn't just a flu. Yeah, I mean, it's not a few cases at all. Flu doesn't give you neurological destruction, overreacting bladder, and permanent kidney and lung damage. I mean, there can be complications from flu, but they're not anywhere near on this level. Yeah, so about CGTN, they changed the classification. So this is China, from Class A to Class B disease. I understand Japan did something similar. So there's international consensus on this. Um, Recent article states measures including nucleic acid testing and centralized quarantine targeting inbound travelers will be dropped. Control measures on the number of international passenger flights will be lifted. Yeah, we were covering some of this yesterday. All right. So let us now go and finish this thing for 2022. Absent some immense breaking news, let's see. Real quick thing here on generating aerosols. Not going to read the whole study, but we'll link it. How much virus does a person with COVID exhale? New research has answers. One super spreader with Omicron shed 1,000 times as much viral RNA as those with Alpha or Delta. So this is from August of this year, published in Nature. And that contraption there has a wonderful name. What did they call that thing? Anyway, just to summarize, people infected with the highly transmissible Alpha, Delta, and Omicron variants of SARS coronavirus 2 spew out higher amounts of virus than do those infected with other variants, according to a study. Furthermore, individuals who contract COVID-19 after vaccination and even after a booster dose do still shed virus into the air. So this is still a preprint, but Nature is covering it. And we have details on the thing here. The infected people faced into a cone-shaped apparatus and sang and shouted, with inevitable coughs and sneezes in between for 30 minutes, while an attached machine collected the particles they exhaled. The device, called a Gesundheit 2, that's just funny, separated out the fine aerosol droplets measuring 5 micrometers or less in diameter, which can linger in the air and leak through cloth and surgical masks. This is why we need N95 or P100, or your country's equivalent. So, yeah, anyway, study here on COVID is airborne. So in case you're having difficulty with that basic fact, COVID is most definitely airborne. The study was showing it. We also have a thread here on masks, which, is it here? Yeah. From Jeremy Howard, at Jeremy P. Howard, I led the team that studied mask efficacy in early 2020 and published our results in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science. I spent 3 months earlier this year revisiting this topic, and today I'm publishing my notes and links here. An admission, these notes were meant to be the basis of another academic paper, but I gave up on it in January 2022. When I finished this research, I looked around. It seemed like no one much cared about avoiding COVID anymore, so I figured it wasn't worth spending the time on the article. But in the last few weeks, this is again in early July, there are signs that folks might be more open to protecting themselves and others by wearing a mask. But the vast majority of public health advice that I see on mask use is scientifically inaccurate. So I'm digging out this research for you. Masks work. An observational study of Beijing households analyzed the impact of mask use in the community on COVID-19 transmission, found that masks were 79% effective in preventing transmission if used by all household members prior to symptoms. However, with Omicron, surgical masks are no longer sufficient in most public settings, while correctly fitted FFP2 respirators do still provide sufficient protection, except in high aerosol producing situations such as singing or shouting. So again, if the more aerosols you're around, the harder your mask has to work, the higher the potential of mask failure. But they do work, but you can't just use the surgical masks. If a surgical mask is all you have in a particular situation, you need a supply of N95s or you need a P100, which is reusable. But if you're in a situation where something happens and all you have is a surgical mask, look up a video on how to tie the ends for a better seal. But yeah, it really doesn't cut it with Omicron anymore. Surgical masks are much less effective than N95s because they're made to stop liquid splashes during surgery, not airborne transmission. But there's a video on how to knot and tuck your mask to improve the fit. But there's really no need to wear anything but an N95 nowadays. They're widely available, inexpensive, and the best ones are comfortable and breathable. There's a 3M Aura N95 mask. We were talking about that before. Those are pretty good, and a lot of people like them. So you can reuse an N95 until the straps wear out. I find that's about 30 times with my usage. Mask maker 3M says there's no time limit to wearing an FFR. Respirators can be worn until they're dirty, damaged, or difficult to breathe through, but I find that the straps wear out first. Now, we've said this before, a lot of the masks will be rated for particular time periods, so do check that. If you use a good mask like the Aura and you're not a healthcare worker, you don't need a fit test. Non-experts get an average fit factor of 100, well over the recommended goal of 10. So even an amateur fit for the seal across your face, making the metal bar conform to your nose and stuff, is going to get you well over the recommended goal. So the goal is 100, but most people get an 88 on average, just even half-assing it, without fit testing with like a fragrant chemical. There is not a shortage of N95s currently, so you do not need to reserve them for healthcare workers. In fact, not enough people are buying them, so profit-driven factories are closing down. There's an article from Bloomberg about Honeywell shutting down 2 mask factories. That's not good. Masks needn't be a substantial burden. A study found that in healthy healthcare workers, N95s did not impose any important physiological burden during an hour of use at realistic clinical work rates. So wear masks, they work. Here's a brief aside about the wearable bioelectronic masks for wireless detection of respiratory infectious diseases by gaseous media. So basically, these are wearable masks that not only filter, but would have a sensor on the outside. Here's a picture of them. This is basically how it would work. These are in development currently. I just came across this study. Basically, there would be a sensor on the outside of the mask, and it would be connected to an app which would tell you if the sensor in your mask is detecting a lot of viral particles. I thought that was cool. Now, as far as detecting things in the air, here's something out of Canada. Website logs carbon dioxide levels to help assess the COVID-19 risk. This is Dr. Kashif Perzada. And so there's this app called the Raven app, and I did check, this is still around. A new web app aims to help people assess their risk of contracting COVID-19 in a particular space by logging the carbon dioxide levels at different locations across the city. So check into this if you're interested in the Raven app. which basically you're going to need a CO2 detector. This is a measure of how fresh the air is. If CO2 levels are very high, then then the air is not very fresh, and your odds of catching COVID may be worse. But they're trying to basically make a log of many different locations with many different readings over time to figure out which places are safer, which are more dangerous. All right, moving on to Paxlovid. COVID-19 treatments like Paxlovid are being underused, says William Hazeltine. This is a real short article. The antiviral drug Paxlovid has the potential to significantly reduce the mortality or death rate associated with COVID, but it's underused by those who would benefit most. A recent CDC report notes that people over the age of 80 are less likely to receive Paxlovid than those under 65. And this thing actually works better the older you are. From April to July this year, less than 1/3 of America's 80-plus-year-old infected with COVID-19 ended up taking Paxlovid. And they're exactly the people who should be taking it. This is a significant issue when those over 65, and especially over those 80, are making up a significant proportion of COVID-19 related deaths. So why is this happening? There are several reasons why patients may hesitate to take Paxlovid, and doctors may be hesitant to prescribe it. We need to address each of these and create targeted outreach and communication to correct it. First, there's the issue of access, which is presently being addressed by the Test and Treat initiative. There's also local hotlines, but greater efforts need to be made to address the lack of these resources in healthcare deserts and rural areas. Second, there's the more complicated issue of public perception. Paxlovid rebound is a common concern. So like Biden and Jill Biden and Fauci and Walensky, they took the Paxlovid, they tested negative for a while, then they tested positive again. So that's true. Paxlovid works by stopping the viral replication. It's currently given for 5 days, but in some people, 5 days isn't enough, and so they get a rebound. It's still better than letting the virus just run its course, but there may need to be longer durations of treatment. Currently, it's just for 5 days. Anyway, Paxlovid is being underused in the elderly populations who benefit from it most. Some studies say that under 65, it really doesn't do anything for you. So yeah, if you are older, definitely keep that one, in mind if you get sick. So also just to note, this is a study on ivermectin. The world has largely moved on from this, but here's a study published in the International Journal of Antimicrobial Agents. High-dose ivermectin for early treatment of COVID-19, a randomized, double-blind, multi-center, phase 2 dose-finding proof-of-concept clinical trial. What did they find? High-dose ivermectin was safe, but did not show efficacy to reduce viral load. So, well-designed study, double-blind, a lot of things that you would want. And they found that it wasn't causing harm when this wasn't horse paste. This wasn't over-the-counter veterinary ivermectin. This was ivermectin given, human-formulated ivermectin given by medical professionals, not self-administered, given, under medical supervision. They found that it didn't cause harm, but it also did not reduce viral load. Just wanted to get that one on the record. People largely don't talk about this anymore. But, yeah. Anyway, what else? As far as the sort of debunking the deniers thing, here's one. Increases in COVID-19 are unrelated to levels of vaccination across 68 countries and 2,947 counties in the United States. So this was published about a year ago. And so basically there's a lot of people saying there's more COVID because of the vaccines. No, this article, if you look it up and we'll put the link, will in fact demonstrate the exact opposite. But again, these are all the bullshit, talking points that have come out over the years, and none of them were correct, but yet people still cling to these things. What else do we have I just want to highlight before closing out? The best reasons to keep up to date with boosters, COVID-19 protection from infection, hospitalization, and death all wane over time. We say this constantly, but it's always good to be reminded of it. And we've talked before about the immune escape potential. So here's a study, risk of rapid evolutionary escape from biomedical interventions targeting the spike protein. This is from about a year and a half ago, and it was basically already known at that time that if you just target the spike protein, which is one of the areas of the virus that's most likely to evolve quickly, then it's just going to evolve to escape whatever it is you're doing to target that. There's another one here, characterizations of enhanced infectivity and antibody evasion of Omicron BA.2.75. And so anyway, the immune escape is rapidly developing in the Omicron strains where, for example, the monoclonal antibodies, as we mentioned, are in some cases becoming completely ineffective. So earlier this month, the FDA pulled a COVID antibody treatment because it's not effective against the dominant Omicron variants. We lost bebtelovimab. I tell you, the longer I stream, the harder it gets here. Bebtelovimab. Yeah, I'm still messing that up. Nice. All right. Well, you can read it there on the screen. Bebtelovimab. Telovimab. I keep wanting to put an extra syllable in it. That's the problem. Anyway, it's been yanked because it doesn't even work anymore. They used to use this one, and the other ones that are still, good to go have diminished capacity against these things. So, what's the solution? Is trying to target other parts of the virus that don't evolve as rapidly. That's one of the things. So the nucleocapsid and the membrane do not evolve as rapidly. So targeting like the nucleocapsid protein may be a better approach because the virus just can't change it as easily. My understanding is the Novavax, newer vaccine, does target the nucleocapsid more, as well as the conserved epitopes. The parts of the virus that are least likely to change, that's what you want to target in your vaccines and antibody treatments because that's more likely to be useful even if the virus mutates. Unfortunately, what we have has been rendered less effective, down to zero in some cases, by the virus's mutation. As we continue our whirlwind tour, duration of effectiveness of vaccination against COVID-19 caused by the Omicron variant. So by 6 months after the primary vaccine series, little protection against symptomatic disease remained. Only 5 studies evaluated any Omicron infection after the primary vaccine series, which showed a mean decline from 1 month to 6 months of just 26.8, 26 to 8 percentage points. So the vaccines are good, but they're becoming less effective, and we need a better long-term strategy, whether it's better vaccines, more community control, whatever it is. It's something looming as we look into 2023 that people should be concerned about. So I wanted to cover also, you can go into this if you look up the individual rates. Well, actually, that's the second topic. So this is from the American Heart Association. Myocarditis risk significantly higher after COVID-19 infection versus after a COVID-19 vaccine. Among almost 43 million people in England who received at least one COVID-19 vaccine dose, the risk of myocarditis was substantially higher in the first 4 weeks after a COVID-19 infection, they actually got the virus in their system, than after the first dose of a COVID-19 vaccine, according to a new study in the journal Circulation. So all the people who, the vaccine, myocarditis, the vaccine is to protect you from the virus, and the virus has a much higher chance of giving you myocarditis than the vaccine is. The vaccine, it's like a few in 100,000. In fact, if we look at that, 3 suspected adverse events reported out of 17,630 Sinopharm vaccine doses, say the Singapore Health Sciences Authority. So here we're not going through the CPC, the Singapore Health Authority is reporting. They had 3 adverse events, this is related to myocarditis, out of the vaccine doses, and out of 17,000, that's really not a lot compared to the kind of things that we see with long COVID and stuff like that. What was the other thing that I saved this as to compare it to? Now, people say sometimes, oh, well, the mRNA are more dangerous. whatever. Actually, in this article, myocarditis among Moderna COVID-19 vaccine recipients, we can dig down into this and find it's really comparable. Plus, the Moderna actually is a better vaccine. So anyway, I'll put a link to this here. But basically, you have comparable rates. All of these talking points are complete nonsense, and it's easily disproved if you actually know how to read a study. All right, last two things here. I want to do a brief section on what you can do. Again, wear a mask, avoid crowds, avoid aerosols. That's to prevent the virus from getting in your body. Plan B is the vaccine. Stay up to date on your boosters and keep your fingers crossed that we get better boosters because they do wane significantly over time. Let's say you do all that and you get COVID and you're vaccinated and you still just want to take the best care of yourself that you possibly can. Make sure that your vitamin D levels are up. I don't have a screenshot on this. Most people are kind of low in vitamin D anyway, especially in the United States. At most of the latitudes, you just literally can't get enough vitamin D from the sun, especially this time of year. The sun is just too weak. Plus, you're wearing a lot of clothing, so your skin is not exposed to the sunlight. So there's that. Supplementing with D is usually a good idea. Getting too much vitamin D, it's involved in calcium absorption, so you can temporarily get calcification or calcium deposits showing up in tissues where it really shouldn't be. This will naturally reverse itself if you stop the D supplementation. That, I think, is about kind of the biggest risk. For most people, I mean, you can ask your provider, but probably somewhere between 2,000 and 5,000 international units or IUs a day wouldn't be a bad idea. Some people take up to 10,000. I think that's a lot. But anyway, that's one thing is keeping your vitamin D up, particularly in the fall through spring as your vitamin D levels may be kind of low. Here's another one. This is a study on N-acetylcysteine. This is a supplement. Again, you can buy it over the counter at high doses as an oral treatment for patients hospitalized with COVID-19. So what they basically did is they gave NAC, N-acetylcysteine, orally, 600 milligrams every 8 hours. So basically 3 times a day, 600 milligrams. You can definitely buy 600 milligram pill. They added it to the regimen of care that they were already giving to people. And what they found was better relevant outcomes in COVID-19 patients treated with NAC at these doses than, where do we have it? Okay, here. Despite greater baseline risk. So the patients that they gave the NAC to had conditions like being older, hypertension, high blood pressure, dyslipidemia, or like fat in your blood. Why am I coming? Cholesterol, things like that. Diabetes and COPD, so lung problems, when compared with those not on NAC. Despite having those pre-existing conditions, so a greater baseline risk, the use of NAC in the COVID-19 patients was associated with significantly lower mortality. So the odds ratio 0.56 was kind of cut in half. A finding that remained significant, in a multivariate analysis, adjusting by baseline characteristics and concomitant use of corticosteroids. So you still want to take the medicine, and they gave them all that usual stuff, but they added this in. And there were no significant differences on the use of NAC on the duration of hospitalization, admission to the ICU, or the need for using a ventilator. So they call for further study as far as why this is and why it apparently had better benefits. But it's something to think about. I mean, a lot of people take this normally. And so if you get COVID, it might be something to add in. Like I said, it's cheap and I'm not aware of any significant risks from taking a dose. If you were to take 600 milligrams or something like that, which I think is a typical amount, something to keep in mind. So we got vitamin D, maybe NAC. Now there's a researcher, Doris Lowe, out there. She writes about long COVID. I have not vetted her thoroughly, so don't quote me on this. I wanted to at least share this though. Ascorbic acid is vitamin C. All right. Non-toxic. The thing about vitamin C, it's water soluble. So vitamin D, on the other hand, or vitamin A, is fat soluble. So vitamin C, like the B vitamins, is water soluble. It means that if you get more than your system wants in it, you're going to pass it in your urine. So there's a limit to how much you should take at a particular time. I believe it's about 1,000 milligrams per hour. It's about the most your body can handle without just, eliminating it in your urine. But basically, this is, it's a non-toxic and cheap thing. Ascorbic acid is not expensive to buy. Vitamin C is not expensive to buy. Only thing you might want to look out for is buffered C. Vitamin C is an acid. It's acidic. It can give you diarrhea if you take a lot of it. But putting that on the screen, and I'll link to this, something to consider, taking large amounts of vitamin C. They talk about, for adults with no to mild symptoms, an initial dose of 3 grams followed by 1 to 2 grams every hour. I would say probably 1, but whatever. It's not really going to hurt you unless you have some really unusual condition. You can consult with your provider if you want. If you do have a list of conditions, for most people, this is not going to be a big deal. And so, anyway, they talk about taking a lot of vitamin C during the course of COVID to help keep some of the symptoms down and to prevent it from doing damage. She also mentions melatonin, and I was looking through her stuff. Melatonin, you may know it as like a sleep, it's a hormone. It helps to regulate, it's produced by your pineal gland in your brain. It helps to regulate your sense of seasons and also of the circadian rhythm, so the day-night cycle, which of course changes over time. In the course of the year, night gets longer in the winter, day gets longer in the summer, and so on. So melatonin helps you to regulate that. But it's not just that. Melatonin appears to be, and there's more research emerging on it, a broad, it's implicated in many healing processes. And, supplementing with melatonin at night, people think of it as a sleeping pill. It's really not. Or a lot of people think of it as a sleeping pill, then take it as a sleeping pill, and then are disappointed with the results. It's kind of better actually for just setting a bedtime. So if you're somebody who deals with jet lag or split shifts and like you're working odd hours and trying to sleep at different times of the day, it can kind of help you cope with that. There's emerging research that shows it has a lot of antioxidant and other beneficial things and the metabolites that it breaks down into and things like that. Anyway, she offers here, melatonin is cheap and it's non-toxic, a protocol for trying to take some higher amounts of melatonin during a COVID illness. She also recommends maintenance dosages. Again, what you do here, this is between you and your healthcare providers, but I wanted to throw out a couple of things. People ask sometimes, I got COVID, what should I do? I have my boosters, and I'm like, besides getting a lot of rest and drinking a lot of fluids, and by a lot of fluids, I mean a lot of fluids, where you're like 2 or 3 times as many fluids as normal, help your body flush things out. And by getting enough rest, I mean lots and lots of rest. Don't go out, don't spread it, things like that. You might try these things as well. Other things people have talked about are zinc, which is often recommended for just, evading colds and things like that in non-pandemic years. You need to be mindful of your zinc to copper ratio that you're getting in your diet, but taking a zinc supplement for a few weeks is not really going to throw things off for most people unless you have a really unusual condition. So I wanted to throw that out there. Lastly, we are closing with one article, and this is, I think, to set, kind of the tone going forward. This was published in Time. Long COVID experts and advocates say that the government is ignoring the greatest mass disabling event in human history. It's a dire note to leave folks on, but I think that this is appropriate. So I'm not going to be able to read this whole thing because it is about 15 screens long, but there was a picture of Mallory Stanislavchek, a disabled former nurse practitioner who suffers from post-COVID illness and giving herself a saline infusion in her Maryland home. Dr. Ezekiel Emanuel is used to feeling like the only person in the country who still cares about COVID-19. He ignores the side eye that he gets for wearing an N95 mask at parties, a self-imposed policy that makes him look odd, but kept him safe after a recent work dinner turned into a super spreader event. The oncologist, bioethicist, and professor at the University of Pennsylvania provides each of his students with an N95 and runs 4 HEPA air filters during lectures. That would be high efficiency particulate, air filter? Yeah, anyway. So the air would be redundant there. He rolls down the windows when he gets in an Uber and goes hungry on planes so he can wear his mask the whole time. And honestly, if you can't refrain from eating for 3 hours, like maybe have that checked. He's given up on one of his favorite pastimes, dining at restaurants, even now that many people don't think twice about eating indoors. Emmanuel, 65, takes these precautions even though he's vaccinated and boosted and thus well protected against severe COVID-19. The acute disease doesn't scare him much, but what could come after does. The only thing that's preventing me from leading a normal life is the risk that I'll get long COVID, Emmanuel says. I can't say why people aren't reacting like their hair's on fire. This is a serious, serious illness. I'm going to actually leave it there right now. This would be most of us in the chat. This is how we talk about COVID all the time. And I think that's a great note to close on for part 3 of our thing. I may put up some additional stuff before the end of the year on the channel, not part of the COVID update. I think we covered like 8 hours of stuff. I think that's plenty for right now. Maybe we'll read this whole article in a future stream, but I will put the link there for people who want to read. I thought this one was actually really good. And again, just to put the title back up on the screen there, there it is. Long COVID experts and advocates say that the government is ignoring the greatest mass disabling event in human history, published in Time. Yeah, couldn't agree more, and people do need to react like their hair is on fire. Let's just close out with the chat, and then we are wrapping up this very long edition of the S4A live stream. Cuba actually has like 11 times less population than Mexico, unless you meant 5 times by another statistic. How are you doing, Brazilian Marxist? I need one of those 3M Aura ones. You know, I've tried a bunch of different N95s. I've probably tried like 6 or 7 different kinds. And there's a real variation in like how comfortable they are. So if you don't like one you get, give it to somebody else and try another one. But a lot of people seem to like the 3M Auras. I don't actually know if I've worn one, but and also if you have a smaller face, get a smaller mask. It can make a huge difference. Sadly, here in Mexico, N95s are becoming so rare. That is sad. And yeah, we've covered before, when you run your healthcare stuff on a for-profit basis, they were throwing out rapid tests earlier because they didn't think they were going to be able to sell them, and it was costing more to like put together the packages than it was to sell them. It's so fucked. Pharmacies don't sell them anymore, and they won't even give you a name for the provider to look up unless maybe I gave them a hefty bribe into telling you. People are talking about where to find masks in Mexico and if there's websites. Yeah, I would look up websites. I mean, I take melatonin for sleep. Yeah, there's a lot of research on melatonin showing it can be helpful for a lot of things. I don't know. I've thought at times of starting a second channel for this stuff. Who knows? Maybe someday. I will say I enjoy doing the COVID stuff, as depressing as it is. But yeah. I have had to scale back on so many hobbies that regarded hanging out or eating at a public place, but it's a small price to pay for your safety and health. Absolutely. How's it going? You missed the stream. What was it about? It was part 3 of the COVID year-end wrap-up. Before I knew who you were in 2020, I was saying pretty much the same thing you said. Free masks, free tests, free vaccine. Massive campaign to change ventilation systems in every building. Massive production of masks and PPE, etc. Yeah. There was footage a while ago of a defunct factory dumping mask manufacturing materials, millions of potential masks destroyed. Yeah, that's what was happening with the rapid tests. What state is this out of curiosity? I forget. It's up on the channel somewhere here. Let me take a look. Um, it's going to be, we have a COVID-19 for Socialists playlist. It would be in there somewhere. Where is it? Where is it? All right. Tried searching on one thing. Okay, so there's a video, Why Healthcare and Public Health Systems Suffer in Capitalism, a COVID-19 case study, Binax Now and CDC. So if you look up that video, it talks about it. You know, I've noticed that the view count on these things has gone down. I think people don't care anymore. I also think that that's sad because it's that old like canard of like, you don't believe in God? Well, God believes in you. I mean, the difference here is like the virus is real, I guess. But I mean, yeah, you can not care about COVID. It still cares about you, though. It sees you as a very suitable meat box for replicating itself. I don't know. You'll care eventually, or you won't. Whatever. But you can certainly get infected still. All right, we've been going for like almost, I don't know how many hours here. We've been going for 3.5 hours. I got to get going. You all have a good New Year's if I don't post anything else, and we will see you. I may not stream next week. I'm not really sure yet. I need a little bit of a break after this, doing the third, ill-advised third stream in a week. It's never really a good idea for me because then I can't turn my brain off for several days of this stuff. It's just overexposure for me. But I do appreciate it, and also thanks to the patrons, as always, and whose names are on the screen. I'm exhausted. You all, I was going to say, this is, have a good New Year's, whatever you do. Let's put it that way. Don't go out and party. If you're going to party, do it with people you're probably already living with, and that the COVID stuff is already settled out with. I don't even know. We're headed for such a bad year next year. I am the least optimistic at this point, realistically, about the short-term situation that I have been in 3 years of doing this channel, to the point where it feels like out and out pointless, honestly, because we found, first of all, that a large subset of people calling themselves Marxist-Leninist are just flat-out neo-fascist. All right, it's not even like they're mistaken. No, they're just neo-fascist. All the people in the Patsock, Caleb Maupin, Infracell, those fucking idiots. And if I ever, somebody sends me a link to one of those videos to check something out, and I see people in the comments who used to be S4A commenters, and they're now over there, just drinking up the swill. Infracell just shitting in their mouths, and they're just rolling around in delight. I don't know what to tell you. A lot of the people, though, who calling themselves Marxist-Leninists were just straight out fascist. And then, a lot of the other leftists were Democrats all along, etc. Is it possible to improve the U.S. left? I don't fucking know anymore. So, we have built a fairly substantial channel here. And, there's like, what do we have? Like 650 videos up at this point? Something like that. And I don't know. I am at a point, I know some of you are listening. And I know some people have said that it has, informed you for the better. But I'm not seeing the translation into action so far. And I know it can take time, and I know it can be surprising. And I do plan to keep doing this for this foreseeable future. But I've got to tell you, there's a lot of stuff where it's just like I don't see the momentum building the way that it needs to. And this isn't just my nitpicky criticism. It's like baseline stuff. I feel in some ways the U.S. left is almost worse off than it was several years ago, which is it's not a good thing. I've definitely been more hopeful at times. Please surprise me, but Yeah, hoping for a better 2023, but preparing for I would guess it's probably going to be twice as bad as 2022. That would be my guess. So, I can say get organized again. We already had some fucking asshat in the chat who was like, "Oh, you're the reason Bush got elected. You're the reason Trump got elected. You're telling people to break from the Democratic Party." Look, the Democratic Party doesn't want anything to do with the left. Whether you're socialist, whether you're even social democratic, they don't want anything to do with you. Get that through your thick fucking skull. So it's just, can you improve the US left? I honestly don't know. That'll be one of the themes we'll be picking up as we go into 2023. But I'll tell you, it's lifting back the lid on the US Marxist-Leninist movement. There's been, I've really enjoyed the Lenin readings. Let's put it that way. Not holding my breath on is the U.S. going to form the party that it needs to form, though. So anyway, all right, that is it. We will catch you next time.